just want to share South Africa some of the what we refer to as the key drivers in the reforming identity management, because as we know, that evolving from manual identity to digital identity exposes the country to a number of things in relation to management of data. But for us, I think what was more important was how do we look at our legal framework, which obviously has a number of systemic challenges to ensure that our legal framework deals with issues that are rather urgent in terms of ensuring that technology, security, and social, economic, social political factors are taken into consideration. And we also looked at those key drivers, which of identity management. One of them is it's a fragmented and outdated legal framework. You know, we've got the Identity Act, will talk to certain areas, we've got other legislation, and I'll talk about them in the next coming slide. If you can move the slides, because I see they are not moving. Oh, must I move it myself? I don't see anything to move the slide. Then the second issue is that we also looked at a lot of increased in identity fraud and corruption. We had a lot of people who are seeking to have access to identity and who misrepresent who they are when they are in the country. And I think we also need to look into how do we improve that. The third element of that is also looking at how inefficient public service delivery is and how we can be able to improve interoperability of systems to ensure that between government databases, we're able to share information. And I think there was a lot of has been spoken about in this conference on interoperability. And also there are other issues around the need for inclusion and the constitutional rights and also digital transformations. I think most governments talk about it at the broad level, the issue of constitutional rights, to say the identity systems need to align closely with the constitutional rights to dignity, equality, access to services. Those are some of the key critical factors. But also earlier on, I think there was also the issue around how can we ensure that as governments, particularly in South Africa, we're increasingly moving towards digital government and smart service delivery in provision, obvious, of e-services, e-education, e-health, and other related factors. And the last point in those is around security and national planning, because a modern ID system is needed to ensure that we better manage migration, border control, and national statistics. So therefore, our identity management reforms in South Africa has followed a multi-phase consultative process. Fortunately, in public policy, we've got to ensure that there's a public buy-in in relation to that. So we've looked at the policy development, did a diagnostic reviews, public consultation with critical stakeholders, which include civil society, academia, legal experts, government department, and ICT sector, because some of it the solutions obviously are sitting with the private sector. Of key importance is what we have now developed, what we refer to as a National Identification Registration Bill, which is currently being finalized before it's signed into law, because it creates a sole authority for identity management that will rest with the Department of Home Affairs. But also we need to ensure that that legislation talks to other pieces of legislation that we currently have. So on the next slide, therefore, we've looked at the legal environment and said, these are some of the policies in the landscape that are impacting on digital identity. The first one, drafted what we refer to as a white paper on affairs, where we are saying as a Department of Home Affairs, we need to position itself to deliver effectively against this mandate as a digital enabler of citizen empowerment, economic development, and national security. On that, we then say we have currently an Identity Act, but it does not talk to the new forms of identity. It's a 1997 legislation. So the Identity Act provides for the foundations for the establishment of the population register and issuing enabling documents to qualifying citizens and residents. And so it will be replaced by a new identification legislation that talks to digital identity, because the current legislation does not deal with that. The third element is we have a protection of personal information legislation, which on the other hand, it prescribes the ground for lawful processing of personal information from private and public sector actors. And it sets the minimum standards regarding accessing and processing of any personal information. So the act is quite important to us to say that whatever legislation on management of citizens' data we take into consideration the provisions of the legislation. And then with that, that if we exist in the cyberspace, how do we ensure that we protect again from cyber crimes because they are continuing to happen all over the world? So we have created obvious legislation that talks to how do we ensure that we protect our citizens' data from any other matters. On the next slide, we talk also about the section 14 of our constitution, which deals with the issue of the right to privacy and unreasonable searches, and also ensure that everyone has a right to privacy, which includes, obvious, the right not to have their home, a person searched, their property searched. How do we ensure that in the management of identity, that particular issue is dealt with? And also the Electronic Communications and Transaction Act protects. Currently, we're talking about digital IDs that must be sitting on digital platforms. How to ensure that that does not get intercepted in order for us. So legislation needs to be able to protect that. And also we've developed the National Data and Cloud Policy Act because, cloud policy, because in most instances, some of this information will be kept on cloud. How do we ensure that there's no actual breach of that particular information? And also the policy proposal relates to the digital infrastructure, cloud computing, data protection and data localization, cross-border transfers, and also cybersecurity measures. So those are some of the key elements that we have taken into consideration in redefining our regulatory environment in order to ensure that we are in compliance. So the next slide, therefore, what we are saying is that a policy and regulatory landscape that protects privacy, addresses risks, addresses systemic risk, and establish a legal framework for digital identity is necessary. Is a necessary for the program to be a success, and also align digital identity system for compliance with national framework and national policy imperative. Of importance is what we refer to as a trust framework, because any person who transacts on any platform needs to be able to establish a trust. So it's therefore important that the digital identity system must be built on the foundation trust, if it is to generate widespread acceptance among the users that unlocks revenues in value-added services, was also helping government to achieve the related sustainable development goals. The role of both government and private sector might also play in the identity environment, because also some of the data gets to sit with the hand of the private sector. How do we ensure that, therefore, we don't have breach in relation to trust? So as a result, some of the research suggests that robust trust frameworks need to be built by aligning several components of digital identity creation, including obvious technical specification and standards and data protection, privacy, and other related laws. The combination of these elements is therefore known as a trust framework. Now, sorry, I just jumped. Now, what we have therefore done as part of concluding this work, we have moved forward to develop a digital citizenship policy, which is intended to help all the users of the network to understand what individuals should know in order to use the technology in a meaningful, responsible, and respectable manner. And also, digital citizenship refers to the ability to think critically and behave safely and participate responsibly in our digital world, because currently there's a lot of irresponsible participation in the digital world that leads to exposure, even for children who are exposed to data that they're not supposed to consume. So too often citizens obviously they misuse and abuse technology. And the issue is more than what the users do not know, but what is considered uh, appropriate technology utilization. So the move therefore to digitize government services and transactions between individuals and governments agencies elevates the digital identity to a new level of commercial and legal acceptance. And these factors obviously make an analysis the functions and legal nature of digital identity in transactional contexts important and timely, and the framework that encapsulates all these frameworks is referred to as a digital citizenship policy for South Africa. Thank you very much.
Right on time. He used his time very wisely. Thank you very much, Mr. Mavuso from South Africa. We are moving into the second presentation now, and I'd like to call on Dr. Aholo from Benin. to come and give us his insights.
Merci. Mesdames, Messieurs, merci à l'équipe organisatrice de ID for Africa pour cette occasion renouvelée donnée au Bénin depuis hier d'abord pour présenter les évolutions récentes en matière d'identification des personnes et aujourd'hui déjà à travers la réforme du cadre juridique, à travers un thème aussi évocateur, les aspects pragmatiques de la réforme juridique de l'état de personne ou de l'état civil épousant l'ère du numérique. L'expérience du Bénin. Déjà, entendons-nous sur une accession vitale qui est avec le doyen. Entendons-nous pourquoi une réforme juridique. Entendons-nous sur une accession capitale avec le doyen Vogel qui nous dit clairement que le droit est une matière vivante qui organise le monde réel et évolue sans cesse. À travers cette assertion, le Bénin s'est résolument engagé, après avoir diagnostiqué les problèmes inhérents à ce système d'état civil, les problèmes que nous partageons largement avec tout ce qui a été évoqué tantôt, c'est les mêmes problèmes. La duplicité en matière d'identité. Nous étions dans un pays dans lequel les individus se connaissent entre eux, mais peinent à justifier leur identité devant les charges publiques, ce qui rend quasiment impossible ou difficile l'accès aux services. À travers ce diagnostic posé, le Bénin s'est résolument engagé sur la voie de la réforme qui a connu plusieurs phases. D'abord, la première phase est partie de la période de 2006. On peut évoluer, s'il vous plaît. Apparemment, on peut évoluer sur les stages suivants. Bon, je continue. La première phase a été marquée par la période 2006. Un instant, hein, j'ai dû m'appuyer à ajuster mon... Très bien. Donc, la première phase a été la période de 2004 à 2006, marquée par l'entrée en vigueur d'une loi majeure qui a été adoptée, la loi 2002, portant Code des personnes de la famille en République du Bénin. Ça, c'était l'amorce du processus de réforme. Après cette première phase, nous avons entamé une deuxième phase qui est partie de 2006 à 2015. Cette phase a connu un nombre important de documents juridiques qui est intervenu à travers d'abord 2006, le recensement, un cadre réglementaire portant recensement administratif à vocation état civil. Du haut de cette tribune, je peux vous assurer que c'est une démarche qui, aujourd'hui, de mon point de vue, est inappropriée pour la résolution des régularisations des personnes sans acte de naissance. Après cette adoption réglementaire de 2006, il est intervenu une autre loi en 2009 portant protection des données à caractère personnel. Ensuite, interviendra en 2009 une autre loi autorisant le recensement électoral national approfondi et évaluant tout ce processus de 2006 à 2015, nous sommes allés maintenant à un forum national pour faire le bilan du chemin couru. Malheureusement, ce chemin n'a pas été refaisant. Ce qui confirme que les faiblesses subsistent à travers le pont effectué jusqu'en 2015, c'est un événement majeur qui est intervenu pendant la période, le processus, la préparation du processus électoral qui devrait être marqué par les candidatures aux élections présidentielles. Donc, l'actuel président, dans la suite logique de préparer sa candidature, était allé à la recherche de sa souche date de naissance qui, malheureusement, c'était totalement opéré absent du registre date de naissance. Chose curieuse, c'était marquant, avait marqué tous les esprits au Bénin, nous justifiant encore une fois encore que nous n'avons pas encore les solutions adéquates aux problèmes d'état civil. Ainsi, à partir de 2015 jusqu'à ce jour, nous avons adopté maintenant cette approche que j'appelle pour tous les États une approche pragmatique caractérisée par la domestication, l'ingénierie juridique, la domestication du droit. Comment l'avons-nous fait à partir de 2016? On peut évoluer, je sais souvent. Ainsi, en 2016, nous avons pu adopter la loi 2017 portant code du numérique en République du Bénin. Cette loi nous a permis, entre autres, de mettre en place l'infrastructure à clé publique, d'adopter la politique de sécurité et de protection des infrastructures critiques. Ensuite, après cette loi, nous avons pu adopter une loi majeure qui est la loi 2017-08 du 19 juin portant identification des personnes en République du Bénin. Cette loi a permis de tenir l'unicité de l'individu à travers le numéro personnel d'identification et a permis de mettre en œuvre une opération majeure qui est le recensement administratif à vocation d'identification des personnes. À l'issue de cette opération, ayant constaté qu'à travers la base de données mise en place, il subsiste un nombre important de citoyens n'ayant pas date de naissance, cette loi nous a permis de mettre en place opérationnaliser une opération majeure qui est la reconstitution des actes de naissance sans souche et qui a permis environ à 500 000 personnes d'obtenir son acte de naissance, puis après plus de 15 millions d'avoir les actes de naissance dématérialisés. Puis après ça, il est intervenu une phase de simplification du droit marquée par l'autorisation d'enregistrement à titre dérogatoire à l'état civil. Après tout ceci, nous avons fait intervenir l'adoption d'une loi 2020-34 portant dispositions spéciales pour la simplification et la gestion dématérialisée des actes de l'état civil. Tant d'actes majeurs qui fondent aujourd'hui et qui consacrent aujourd'hui l'évolution récente du processus de gestion dématérialisée des actes de naissance en République du Bénin. Nous pouvons avancer. Et là, pour caractériser au regard de tout ce processus, les typologies, je peux dire d'ores et déjà que, la réforme amorcée au Bénin permis de moderniser l'état civil épousant à travers le cas juridique qui épouse l'ère du numérique. Ensuite, de simplifier toutes les procédures administratives pour favoriser en réalité l'usager. Puis enfin, de mettre le garde-fou nécessaire pour éviter les fraudes entourant le dispositif de mettre en place. Et d'assurer par le biais de ce moyen aussi l'inclusion générale de toutes les catégories de notre population. En conclusion, je peux déjà vous rassurer que, en termes de perspective, les résultats ont été éminemment évoqués hier par le directeur général de l'AMIF ici. Et en termes de perspective aujourd'hui, nous envisageons mettre un cadre réglementaire en place pour cerner l'identité numérique et mettre en œuvre. On peut évoluer. Oui, l'étude de l'identité numérique et l'opérationnalisation ensuite de toutes les unités à travers le Bénin, la mise en place d'une unité déconcentrée de la NIP. Le renforcement du système d'identification à travers le système de l'infrastructure à clé publique et l'organisation générale en contenu d'une opération de masse. Brièvement, en attendant les préoccupations, c'est ce que, en termes d'évolution récente en matière de réforme du système de l'état civil, c'est ce que je voulais dire. Merci beaucoup pour votre aimable attention. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Very insightful views there from Benin. Somehow we are still managing within the 10 minutes that are allocated. Our next presentation is coming from Cameroon, Mr. Kamden Kowam. Let me call upon you now to come and give us the insights from Cameroon.
Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, in all protocol due respected, it's my pleasure to represent today my country and most especially the Ministry of Local Development and Centralization to make you a presentation on the modernization of the legal framework of the system of registration of civil status in our country. And let me first acknowledge the ID for Africa for this invitation and also say the presentation that is going to be made will make a focus mostly based on the civil status registration, because in our country we have various ministries that are in charge of identity and civil status registration at large. And of recent, in 2025, the head of state of our country signed a decree to organize the issuance of this national identity card, which brought in new elements of digitalization and to secure more our nationality and also our identity. Apart from that, in 2024, we also had at the level of National Assembly a law that was passed to protect our data. And we have some innovation that were brought by that instrument. But we are going to focus mainly on the regulation that was put in place in 2024 by our parliament and promulgated by the head of state of our country. That is the law to organize the civil status registration in our country. And the said law was adopted in a context in which they were having some difficulties in registering all the Cameroonians, and there were some difficulties in securing our nationality, and most especially, we wanted to go towards digitalization, but our legal framework never permitted us. We were accompanied by various partners, and those partners have helped us in some experimental operations that were going on the field, but they couldn't have a legal value because there was no legal backing for it. So the new law entered into force in 2024, December 33rd, reaffirmed and some fundamental principle of civil status that we all know. That's the principle of free deliverance of the civil status certificates, the principle of the permanence of the civil status public service, the equal access of all citizens, universality of the service of civil status. We also have in our country a bilingual nature, and since we are both English and French speaking, and therefore there is an obligation to print all our certificates in French and in English to make sure that both languages are taken into consideration, and also affirmed the authenticity and the intangibility of the certificates that are being delivered within the civil status registration. Secondly, we had, in terms of second element of our law, the process of simplification and modernization of the procedures in our civil status. Et concernant ce processus de modernisation et de simplification, nous avons travaillé d'abord à une bonne réduction des délais parce que nous avions de grosses difficultés en matière de déclaration des faits d'état civil et donc nous avons essayé de rallonger les délais pour permettre de pouvoir capter l'ensemble des naissances de 70 à 90 jours et même augmenter jusqu'à 1 an pour les personnes qui ont accouché euh, à travers donc des réquisitions soit du procureur, soit du sous-préfet. Mais on a aussi élargi les autorités qui peuvent solliciter une réquisition pour l'enregistrement de naissance et surtout simplifier une procédure de reconstitution des actes d'état civil perdus. Parce qu'avant, lorsqu'il fallait reconstituer un acte d'état civil, il fallait passer par la procédure judiciaire. Désormais, si l'on a la souche et qu'on sait qu'on peut aller dans un centre d'état civil qui conserve la souche, on peut donc simplement se faire délivrer une copie intégrale de cette souche qui aura la même valeur que l'acte de naissance. On a également eu des avancées en matière de transcription des mariages coutumiers et bien sûr, prise en compte des personnes déplacées internes dans la délivrance des actes d'état civil ou dans la reconstitution de celle-ci. Ce qui permettait avant, dans notre contexte, de permettre aux personnes déplacées internes de ne plus rentrer dans les lieux où ils doivent obtenir, où ils sont nés pour obtenir ces actes, mais de le faire directement dans les lieux où ils se trouvent et où ils ont dû se déplacer. En dehors de ces éléments, nous avons fait un bond vers la digitalisation. Et à travers cette digitalisation, on a donc consacré le principe que l'État devra mettre en place un fichier national de l'état civil qui devra donc comprendre l'ensemble des données d'état civil des personnes sur le territoire camerounais, nationaux ou non nationaux. Et en plus, on a institué l'attribution d'un numéro d'identifiant unique personnel, un IPU, qui aura donc qui devra être délivré à l'ensemble des Camerounais, que ce soit ceux qui vont être enregistrés à la naissance ou ceux qui viendront plus tard, ou ceux qui sont déjà là qui sont déjà en vie. Mais au-delà de cela, nous avons également, et comme je l'ai indiqué précédemment, des expériences pilotes qui avaient été mises en place avec l'accompagnement de bailleurs de fonds et qui donc ont été validées à travers cette opération. Donc, tous les actes qui ont pu être délivrés lors de cette opération pilote ont effectivement été validés par cette nouvelle loi. Il faut également relever que l'objectif de cette loi a également été de rénover l'architecture des acteurs ainsi que le financement, parce que l'un des ventres mous de l'état civil dans nos pays, c'est le financement. Et donc, en termes d'acteurs, on a non seulement réaffirmé les acteurs qui existent, que nous connaissons déjà, notamment les communes, les missions diplomatiques et les postes consulaires, mais on a également ajouté une nouvelle catégorie d'acteurs dans notre contexte, à part en dehors des centres d'état civil secondaire, qui sont des centres qui sont créés par l'État et non, qui ne sont pas les principaux. On a créé des centres d'état civil spécialisés dans les formations sanitaires. Ceci pour capter le maximum de naissances afin que lorsque l'enfant entre à la naissance, il ressorte directement avec son acte d'état civil et ne pas donc laisser des enfants qui n'auraient pas d'acte de naissance. Et pour ceux qui sont nés en communauté, les centres d'état civil secondaires pourront les rattraper ainsi que les centres principaux. On a renforcé les missions qui ont été données à l'organisme qui est en charge de conduire le processus de digitalisation de l'état civil dans notre contexte, qui est le BUNEC, dont je salue la présence du directeur général avec nous. Et parce qu'ils devront être préposés donc au traitement des données personnelles, ils ont une obligation de prestation de serment, ceci pour effectivement protéger ces données. Mais au-delà, on a également institué un mécanisme de financement de notre état civil en créant un guichet qui a un certain nombre de ressources qui sont captées qui proviennent du budget de l'État. Parce qu'effectivement, l'état civil étant une cause nationale, on a estimé qu'il était de la responsabilité de l'État de financer premièrement avant de chercher un apport des partenaires qui peuvent appuyer dans ce processus. Au-delà de ces réformes qui ont pu être mises en place, nous avons également les acteurs de l'état civil que sont les officiers qui, au niveau des centres secondaires et spécialisés dont nous avons parlé, ont eu un mandat qui leur sera maintenant confié parce que dans notre contexte avant, les officiers des centres secondaires avaient une durée illimitée. Une fois nommés, ils pouvaient rester ad vitam aeternam et on avait une une tentation héréditaire de transmission de cette fonction. Aujourd'hui, elle sera donc adossée à un mandat de 5 ans qui sera renouvelable sur la base de la performance. Ceci pour que lorsque les personnes seront déclarées et que les actes sont établis, il faudrait que ces actes soient remis aux bénéficiaires. On a également proposé donc pour permettre à ces personnes d'exercer, s'ils ne sont pas déjà pris en charge ou rémunérés par un organisme public, de bénéficier donc d'une allocation mensuelle. Et bien sûr, pour protéger encore l'état civil davantage et surtout avec l'entrée dans la digitalisation, un certain nombre de mesures en termes de sanctions au plan pénal et au plan administratif ont été instituées par cette nouvelle loi. En fin de compte, il y a un ensemble de textes réglementaires qui devront être pris et qui auront pour lesquels nous sommes déjà en termes de perspective de travailler, qui vont nous permettre de pouvoir aller vers le plein emploi en matière de digitalisation. So we are trying to end up our presentation by insisting on the fact that this achievement that we have made in our context brought us into the new era of modernization, and we are targeting to make sure every Cameroonian in our country is being seized, and the foundation of all of it is the legal framework. It's on this that I'm going to thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
He was right on time as well. It is indeed a new era. Thank you very much, Cameroon. Please make sure that you join Slido and ask those questions that you have, because our next presentation is the last one. And immediately thereafter, we are going to get into the Q&A. So make sure that you ask those very pertinent questions that you want answered to assist you to also make your legal reform much smoother to ensure digital identity. Join me in welcoming Mozambique, Dr. Mourinho Shimane, to give us the last presentation for this session.
Boa tarde a todos. Antes de começar a parte da apresentação, gostaria de começar por agradecer a todos. É uma honra e um privilégio representar o governo de Moçambique nesta apresentação na conferência ID for Africa 2025. Vou fazer a apresentação em inglês, podem ficar tranquilos. Só queria pedir desculpas antecipadas pela qualidade do inglês, porque a nossa língua oficial, portanto, em Moçambique é português. Obrigado. We would like to thank IDFAR for the opportunity given to Mozambique to share what we have been doing in the field of legal and regulatory framework for the development of digital identity in our country. We started our process by reviewing the literature and the experience of other countries around the world, and we found a lot of information already available from the scientific and technical point of view on this field. But we'd like to highlight 4 frameworks that are influencing our work in Mozambique on developing our legal and regulatory framework. The first one is the United Nations Development Programme Model Governance Framework for Digital Legal Identity System. The second one is the African Union Interoperability Framework for Digital ID. That we are looking carefully also to the World Bank framework and also to the European Union to make sure that what we're doing in our country is aligned with the best practice and around the world. We look also to the beautiful work being done by ID for Africa for the past years, and we look to these elements that characterize the recommendation of ID, that approach in the country, the foundational ID and also the functional ID and its relationship and the role of the national ID register. From this framework, we mapped the current situation of Mozambique in order to understand what are we doing well, where we are not going well, and which aspects to improve in order to make sure that in the coming years we'll be having a framework that supports the development of the digital transformation in our country in all the fields related. So we look into the system that are being implemented, the support and the enabling institutions and the ministries that are here indicated: Ministry of Home Affairs, of Justice, Ministry of Communication, Digital Transformation, Ministry of Finance, Attorney General officers, civil society organizations, private sector, and even donor organizations that are all engaged somehow in functional identity. But these ministry or government departments are related to foundational identity. And I think that's important to make sure that if you want to have a coherent system and allowing interoperability to drive the digital transformation, all these frameworks and law must be enacted. We have the current laws in our country, the electronic transaction law approved in 2017, the law on the revision of the civil registry code in 2018, the legal regime for civil identification and the national citizen identity card in 2022, the regulation of the digital certification system in 2019, the decree approved in 2010 that defines procedures for the creation and the use of a unique citizen identification number and the attributions of each institution that's part of this ecosystem, and also the regulation for interoperability framework for e-government in Mozambique. This is the current regulatory framework from the technical point of view to drive the services in for digital identity. But our analysis using the framework that the theoretical framework that we reviewed indicated to us that what has been done is not sufficient, that is, there's still work to be conducted. And we identified these laws that need to be prepared. And we're currently working in preparation of the data protection law, the cybersecurity law, the cybercrime law, the data governance framework, the national AI strategy, the national digital transformation strategy, and the digital government strategy. We are preparing these new instruments, taking into account the framework that's guiding us for the development of the digital transformation strategy in our country. That's under the responsibility of the newly established ministry, is the Ministry of Communication and Digital Transformation. And these are the main elements. And as it can be seen, as part of the general framework for digital transformation in our country, the policy, legal, regulatory, and institutional frameworks is one of the foundations for digital transformation. And the work that we're doing is part of the implementation of this. And it's enable digital business and digital government services that must be provided to the entire society and must be inclusive. And as part of the policy side that goes hand in hand with the legal and regulatory framework, we're drafting the digital government system interoperability framework, the digital ID and mobile ID platforms, the citizen digital service portal, the Mozambique digital certification system implementing authentication, authorization, and digital signatures, the digital payment gateway, but to make sure that all the citizens, wherever they are in the country, have access and benefit from this ecosystem, we are promoting other digital transformation related initiatives. For example, the Internet for All initiative that's make sure that each citizen, wherever he is in the country, has access to good quality broadband communication networks, the digital services in priority areas for the development for country like education, health, agriculture, tourism, climate change, exploitation of natural resource, and also financial services. And it's important we're looking also to the strategic partnership. We believe that this cannot be done only by government partners. It's important to have partnership with private sector and also looking for the financial challenge and also sustainability issue as part of the deployment of our work. We're developing our concept of digital identity that goes beyond to the identification of the individual or physical persons. Looking to the challenge of AI, we believe that our digital identity ecosystem should be able to include individual, machines, computers, applications, devices, and also the current development of emerging digital technology, in particular of artificial intelligence, to make sure that all the laws that are preparing as part of the legal and regulatory environment will be fit to address the use of digital identity for formal identity, but also for functional identity in the areas that we have indicated here. This is an example of a use case of what we're trying to implement in our country. We are currently implementing the digital certification of Mozambique. We are following the electronic transaction law approved in 2017. And based on this, we have established the steering committee for digital certification that's chaired by the Honorable Prime Minister. And we established the certification authority of the state. And based on the decree, which is the regulation approved in 2019, we are now preparing to start providing authorization for the second layer certification authorities. And this will enable the third layer of hierarchical structured framework for digital certification to make sure that the registration authorities will use civil identification law and data protection law and the interoperability framework to make sure that when they onboard citizens, they conduct that process based on the law that has been defined and indicated here. And the technologies that we are looking for, we are following a hierarchical chain of certification, including both public and private entities. And we are doing our best to make sure that all the technical implementation is based on international standards that are recognized and are being indicated and approved by the regulatory authority. And as we mentioned, as the next step of the work that we're doing, we will use as the reference the public key infrastructure, provide authentication, certification, authorization, and subscription of digital services. And this platform has been implemented and it's working. We are in a pilot phase, and a number of entities are now signing documents based on this framework. Our colleagues from the National Directorate of Identification and Civil Registry are implementing the new ID cards based on the law that we've shared that has been approved recently. And we are currently reviewing the digital citizen platform that will use mobile identification in order to make sure that the authentication and certification is based on the public key infrastructure and deliver digital services to the citizen. And the interconnection between the different entities that part of the ecosystem will be based on interoperability. We are doing our work also based on international standards. We are concerned with cybersecurity and cybercrime. We are looking to the laws and standards available internationally, the AU Malabo Convention, the European Union Budapest Convention, and the recently approved United Nations Convention on Cybercrime. Make sure that all the work is done in a collaborative way. And this is the last slide. We believe that with the work that we are conducting in our country will contribute to digital development and cybersecurity, potential growth of the digital market and promotion of the digital economy, creation of the basis for digital integration and regulation within the African Union from free market, and lastly, improve interoperability between government system and collaboration between the different entity part of the public administration and delivering public service. And thank you for attention. And as I mentioned, this is a collective work for colleagues from the National Directorate of Civil Identification, Ministry of Communication and Digital Transformation, and also National Director of Registries and Notaries. Thank you very much.
Okay. So that applause was only for Mozambique. Let's have another bigger round of applause for all our 4 panelists who have shared so generously with us lessons from the countries. We are now going to get into the Q&A, and hopefully your question has made it onto Slido. And we have only 15 minutes. So my dearest panelists, when you answer, please be to the point. Maybe let us start off by finding out from all the panelists. One thing that is coming out is that this is not a one ministry or one agency responsibility. One of the questions we have is that different acts are likely to fall under different institutions. Who takes the lead and how do you ensure smooth collaboration for the drafting process? Can we start with Mozambique? Can we have that question up? Different acts or bills are likely to fall under different institutions. Who takes the lead? And how do you ensure smooth collaboration of the drafting process? Let's start with the collaboration part. Cameroon.
Thank you very much. That's a difficult question, but I'll share what we've been doing so far. In Mozambique, each government department has its own role and responsibility, and based on that, they take the initiative to prepare the law on that on specific item or topic. But the government of Mozambique has a process to prepare legal and regulatory instrument. That is not only for ID, but for all the other. There is no decree that's prepared up to the end without the involvement of the public, of the private sector, and also between government departments before it is tabled to the Council of Ministers and later on to the Parliament. This is the process that will make sure that there is coordination on the activities that we are doing. But the Ministry of Communication and Digital Transformation in this new mandate has a higher responsibility in terms of coordinating all the developments related to the digital society in the country. And yes, our minister work with the other ministers in terms of coordinating the process of development. But so far, each government department is taking a lead, but using the structure of the government to make sure that there's coordination and collaboration.
Okay, thank you very much, Cameroon. Do you have a different experience?
Thank you very much for the question. Concerning Cameroon, the organization of the government take into consideration the specialization of each of the domain. So when we talk of civil status registration, it's the department, the ministry to which I belong that is ahead. When we talk of legal identity, we have the national general delegation of national security, that's police, that is in charge of it. When we talk of data protection and everything concerning the IT, we have a ministry in charge of post and telecommunication that is taking the lead. But whenever we have laws or regulation allowed to be drafted, it's been drafted in collaboration. There is one ministry that takes the lead to produce the first draft, but it's being examined in interministerial commission. And once it's been end at the level of the ministry, is now being set at the level of Prime Minister's office, where the Prime Minister's office and the collaborators will convey all the ministries that are in charge of following the policy. And after at the level of the Presidency of the Republic, where all the other administrations are still conveyed. So it's isn't there might be a ministry that will have the lead, but at the end there is a coordination that makes sure that the policy, all the policies are interoperable and are working hand in glove to go in the goals that have been set by the executive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's coming out very clearly that in as much as it's a multi-stakeholder process that needs to take place, there has to be one that takes the lead, depending on how the setup is in a particular country. I will not let the other two countries answer the same question, but I'll move on to the next question that has received the most votes on Slido. So we will start right in the middle. What measures are in place to prevent identity fraud during digital ID issuance? Legal and operational measures. Can we go with you? Benin? Oh, translation.
Merci. Comme je l'avais dit tantôt, le processus d'élaboration des nouvelles lois au Bénin intègre un cadre global prenant en compte les principes fondamentaux d'une loi, dont fondamentalement la lutte contre la fraude. À juste titre, un élément innovant de cette loi vise à lutter contre ce qu'on peut appeler le faux témoignage en matière, en matière documentaire. Le faux témoignage aujourd'hui est passible d'une peine de 5 à 10 ans au moins. Tout ceci dans un conseil général marqué par l'existence d'abord des agences issues du cadre institutionnel, notamment une agence nationale système ASIN, Agence nationale des systèmes d'information et du numérique, qui gère fondamentalement le côté cyberattaque, qui nous permet en réalité de faire remonter toutes les tentatives de fraude inhérentes au dispositif mis en place, avec une autorité d'identité nationale à travers l'Agence nationale d'identification des personnes créée par la loi 2017 portant identification des personnes en République du Bénin. Et que sais-je encore avec un ministère sectoriel qui est le ministère du numérique qui coiffe l'ensemble de cet écosystème d'identification. Donc, en matière de lutte contre la fraude aujourd'hui, le Bénin s'est basé fondamentalement sur un cadre juridique approprié, marqué par les agences, un cadre institutionnel marqué par l'existence des agences claires et avec des attributions claires en matière de lutte contre la fraude. Merci.
Thank you very much, Benin. Can we have South Africa also answer the same question? Hopefully adding on to what has not already been said.
Yes, no, thank you very much. Just to indicate that in terms of our legal and operational measures that we have put in place, the first thing that we have done is that we have ensured that all children newly born are allocated with an ID number at birth in order for us to be able to secure that identity of the child. But we are taking the steps further and introducing the infant footprint, because what we've done in the research is that we've discovered that the minutiae on the fingerprint of the child does not change the pattern as the child grows. But what it does, it grows, but patterns remains the same. So therefore, at the time when we have to issue the legal or the ID, one, you already have the ID number at birth, but secondly, you would have secured those particular what do you call infant footprint when the child is still young. So those are measures that we are taking moving forward in order for us to be able to prevent identity fraud. But also we do authentication, obvious, of biometrics as part of our ABIS program development. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So it needs to be established as early as possible. There is a specific question that seems popular for Benin, and we'll get to that in just a while. But one of the questions that is coming up, and maybe let me start on with Mozambique, addressing this particular question. What key legal gaps must be addressed to ensure that data protection, digital ID interoperability, and user consent in African legal frameworks? So what do we need to address in our legal frameworks to ensure that the areas of data protection, digital ID, interoperability, consent by the users is actually taken care of?
Thank you very much. This is really an important question. I'll share what is the starting point for addressing this question in our country. We have this basic understanding that all the work that's being done from for legal and regulatory frameworks to protect the citizen, and that what characterizes the citizen on the digital space is data and information, and other intervenients or actors from private sector and other entities from the public administration, they must collect, process, and use this data, taking into account the rights of the person, of the citizens, and also make sure that there is a process of approval by the citizen, of consent when his own data is being assessed, is being collected, and is being used. These are the elements that are guiding our work. From the legal point of view, all the laws that we're drafting, the data protection law, the cybercrime law, the cybersecurity law, are exactly to address this question. The data protection law is to establish the limitation on how to collect the data, how to access, and the rights of the citizen. The cybercrime is to enforce its adoption and curb the crime that's related to data. The cybersecurity law is to address the operational and technical measure that each entity should implement when handling information system that treat data of the citizen, to make sure that they follow the data protection law from the technical operational point of view. So we start from the end of the rights of the citizen, the privacy. These are the elements that we are taking into account in crafting the laws that we're doing. And also on the implementation phase, there's the supervision component to make sure that what is stated in the law and also in the regulation, it's in fact being implemented. And if it's not, there are measures and responsibility that should be taken in order to make sure that everyone respects the right of the citizen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cameroon. On the very same question, but let me rephrase it. What was the one gap you identified in your laws that absolutely had to be changed for you to be able to get into the digital identity space?
For our country, the gaps that we identified is that we, before 2024, we never had a law on data protection. We had a law on cybersecurity, on electronic communications, but that were not sufficient to be able to ensure the data protection in our country. And also, if we wanted to go towards a digital identity on interoperability, we needed first that our civil status registration, that for us, the base of the legal identity, should have a legal framework. And it's through the 2024 law, as we mentioned, that we have achieved it. And secondly, we never had a data protection law in our context. And as we have identified it, with the help of some key partners like the World Bank, we were able to draft such laws, and that were passed already. So today we have a good legal framework that will permit us to ensure the data protection and also the interoperability. And concerning the interoperability, we are also having institutionally some commission that are put in place to permit that actors of civil status, of legal identity, and data protection are joined together to work hand in glove to protect better our data in our country. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. We cannot do without data protection. So unless we have that in place, we will continue to talk about digital identity and not really get to digital identity. Now, Benin, there's a specific question that is popular for you. How does the legal framework for the ID system include stateless persons and refugees?
Merci. À partir de constats amers effectués au Bénin, caractérisés par la remise en cause des approches classiques d'identification des personnes, notamment l'acte de naissance qui ne répond plus à sa fonction première d'identifier l'individu, de dire en quoi moi je suis différent de l'autre. Nous avons commencé par, juste après ce diagnostic, nous sommes rendus compte qu'il faut aller au nouveau procédé d'identification. Et cette fois-ci, ces nouveaux procédés d'identification se sont inscrits dans une approche de durabilité, c'est-à-dire l'inclusion. Ce qui fait que l'adoption de la loi 2017-08 du 19 juin portant identification des personnes en République du Bénin permet à tout individu sur le plan national, sur le territoire national, de se doter d'un numéro personnel d'identification. Il ne peut être reçu qu'à partir à travers son inscription au registre national des personnes physiques, que vous soyez réfugié, que vous soyez résident, c'est-à-dire étranger, résident au Bénin ou béninois même de l'extérieur, ce droit vous est conféré à travers les obligations juridiques consacrées à travers la loi 2017. Merci.
And unfortunately, that wraps up our session. There are still a lot of questions that are not answered on Slido. So I'd like to kindly request our panelists to go on Slido and provide answers, especially to questions that are targeted at specific countries. Have you enjoyed the session as much as I did? Then you must give us a round of applause. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much to our distinguished panelists. Let's just stand and have the cameraman capture the moment. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Should I start? Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sanya, and I'm really sorry that I'm getting in the way of our afternoon siesta session, but we'll keep it short, we'll keep it interesting, and we'll tell some stories and we'll just talk about this topic. And feel free to ask some questions. I think the Slido link will open up again, so you can ask as many questions as you want. Um, so maybe quickly introducing myself, I'm Sanya Ansar. I'm with the World Bank. I look at topics that fall under identification for development, a topic that some of you are already familiar with. We work with a few different countries in the region, but also across the world. And my focus primarily is around topics that involve us to do research or on topics such as inclusive ID and thinking about what makes an ID inclusive. I'm wearing two hats today because our superstar from our team couldn't come here to moderate. So I'm also the moderator and the presenter. But I'm joined here today by Professor Edgar, who's a professor of information systems at LSE. He has been studying and has published extensively on identity systems for over 20 years, has advised governments in Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, India, Jamaica, Japan, Mexico, on topics such as the political, technological, and social challenges of effective identity policies. And he's also worked extensively with a lot of development partners that we have amongst us today. So I'm sure he'll have plenty to share. Together, the two of us will talk about what are the effective policies and strategies for fostering inclusion, what do we need to look at from a research perspective, and what are the economic costs of identity inclusion, which I'm very excited to hear more from Edgar. So maybe let's start with the problem today, which is my clicker for starters. Okay, great. So there's a few things that we already know about the world we live in today. We know 850 million people, mostly women and marginalized people, do not have a legal ID. We also know that when they don't have a legal ID, we are excluding them from exercising rights, accessing services, other opportunities that are available to them. We also know that people who actually have an ID are unable to usually use it because it's not secure, it's not verifiable, sometimes it's not accurate. This often affects people who are marginalized. And then we also know, and this is data that we've been collecting recently, that about 3.3 billion people in the world today are not using their ID to access transactions online. This is huge because if we're talking about a digital divide, this only makes it worse. And then when we're thinking about what it means to have an inclusive ID, and Edgar will also share more about it, but what we really want to emphasize here is that if you don't have an ID, you're getting locked out of a lot of other services. So it really becomes a hard constraint for other rights and opportunities. So if the ID system is more inclusive, that means the disadvantaged group, the women, the refugees, the minority groups, all of those people are more likely to benefit from it. And so maybe shifting gears a little bit, uh, there was a Slido slide, but anyway, we'll skip that. Okay, sorry about that. So there was supposed to be a poll, but we'll skip it, and that's okay. So when we're thinking about the different kinds of products that we can think about. So when you're thinking about research, there are different tools that you can use. So sometimes some people say, let's do an impact evaluation, or let's do a qualitative study, or maybe we need a focus group discussion. And I think it takes away a little bit from how we want to focus and learn more about this topic, right? So what we want to focus on is how can we improve implementation? How can we demonstrate impact on goals? And when we think about this, suddenly the problem becomes a little bit more clear, and what we want to do also becomes more clear. So we want to do agile studies, so like fast studies that can support the design, the rollout of different kinds of programs. We also want to measure what DPI integration is. So we can then say things like 850 million people around the world don't have an ID, or 300 million people can't do a certain use a certain service. So this has really been the center of a lot of the work that we do. So we have a question here. A quick raise of hands to show who's still listening to me and who wants to do the poll. So raise their hands. Okay, great. So we got 15 people. Maybe we can raise more hands. Okay, so here's a poll on the right. If you want to quickly join it, and then maybe answer this question for me, which is really asking you about what does inclusion mean to you? And we'll see what the results are. Maybe we'll just use the next 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 seconds to do this. So let's see the responses, which we can't anymore. Okay, so this is great. I see the responses on the screen in front of me, but not there, which is fine. It was a trick question. 85% of the people were awake and answered it correctly. I think the question really was, what are the different things that you think about when you're thinking about an inclusive ID, right? So obviously, it's not just about physical access, but it's also about removing legal and statutory barriers. It's also thinking about making it more design inclusive. What do you do in a more low digital literacy environment, and how do you make it more inclusive when you think about that? So great, we'll move on to the next slide. So back to our slides here. The main thing that I want to focus on, next slide, please. Okay, so the main thing I want to focus on is the 3 boxes that you see here, which is what are the 2 things that we want to do when we're designing products. So first off, we want to put people at the center of design. We want to think about people when we're designing these programs and when we're designing, rolling out different programs. How do we do it? We do it in a few different ways. Two thoughts? Okay. So one of the things that we did recently is we looked at the ID rollout program by NIRA in Somalia. So we had two objectives. Thanks. We had two objectives. One, to understand the registration experience of registrants and the registration officers. And then second, to identify potential barriers to registration. The second piece is very interesting to me. So we found some early findings, and this is the study. We just finished it maybe a few weeks ago, so this is fresh off the press. And one of the things that we found that female registrants who were coming to register themselves at the ID offices by NIRA, they were more likely to be more advantaged. So they were younger, more educated, had more rights, less responsibilities. But then we also have discovered other things. So of course there's like physical barriers, but then there were other barriers that came around the registration journey and experience. So women were more likely to pay for transport. They were more likely to arrange childcare before coming. They had to get permission from their household head or the male guardian. They also had to register in groups, so they couldn't come by themselves. And so when you think about these things, there are all these procedural barriers that we think about when we're thinking about rolling out ID systems. But there are these socioeconomic pullbacks that keep restricting certain groups from registering, and these are outside of like what we usually think about when we're thinking about design or legal barriers. Another thing that I want us to think about is we keep saying digital, and the whole shift has been around moving to digital ID, but we have to remember the digital services still have physical touch points. So how do we ensure that the people that they need to serve are actually able to access them? And in order to do this, we're trying to do a geomapping study in a few countries where we're trying to map out the GPS coordinates for existing offices. So if you can do that on a map, you have the coordinates, you can do that. That's our first step. Our second step is looking at population density, which is just satellite data. You can always get that off the internet. So you can map out here in the dark green areas where high populous locations are. And then you can map out travel times. That's just the time it takes to travel a certain distance. And then when you get to the final result, when you triangulate these 3 points, you arrive at the underserved areas for a mobile campaign. So here in the blue box here, you'll see these are all the people who had to travel more than 8 hours in order to go to an ID office and access services, which we think is very difficult because that means they take half time from work, they have to pay for travel, they have to make other arrangements, as we just saw. And using something like this, which we encourage you to do as well because our toolkit is coming out soon, you can use this to learn more about your own country by using the same kind of integration software. The other piece that I wanted to talk about is, I think, has been catching a lot more traction. And this is thinking more about the design piece, right? So you have a process. Someone goes to a bank to open an account. What are the different steps that they take? Everyone has a different number for time and the costs associated with it. What we do is that we measure this. So we just did a study in Ethiopia where we measured the time and the process it takes for someone to access a service and a provider or relying party to offer the service. And we looked at the time it took, the costs that they had to incur. And what it meant that what we did is that we mapped out the exact business process from the time someone enters the office to the time they get the actual result that they needed. And we collected these observations, and we do this for like several days. So real stories start to come out after multiple days. But then once we have these observations, then we can model the to-be process. So what is it that we need this process to look like if you integrate an ID into it? And when we did this in Ethiopia, we were planning to do this along with the rollout of FEDA. And we studied a few different processes, the financial sector, legal, telecommunication, for SIM card subscription. And then we looked at different outputs. So one of them was, of course, like thinking about what are the savings to providers? What are the measurements for how long it takes? And then what are the recommendations on how you can stream these different services as you look at FEDA integration? And this is my favorite slide because this is just for one of the sample, let's say, processes that we looked at. In the column on the left, you can see how much time it currently takes, so the status quo. But in the middle and on the right, you'll see the projected time savings, which is if you introduce FEDA, you could save the time that it needs by 63%, the cost savings for applicants by 63%, and for banks by a third of what it is, which is not just great for optimizing your process and making it more inclusive, but it also shows you all those informal or hidden costs that are laid into the process for a lot of the applicants. And then you can use this to set fees, you can use this for advocating for government budget. And there are a lot of different things that you can just understand about the process as you think about this. And then finally, a thing that we've been doing for years. We already know that 850 million people are without an ID, but how do we know this? We know this because we collect data on ID ownership around the world every 3 years. So the new data is coming out, which means new estimates will be released later this year. So I'm very excited about that. What I'm also excited about that we'll have new data on how people use their ID to access online transactions. So hopefully we can use that and build on it in the future years as like these technologies grow. We're also looking at a high level DPI diagnostic. So what is a measurable framework that we can use to track progress? And where is it that we need to like center our investments? And ultimately, we're just looking for ways to benchmark and show what the maturity level is, what the readiness is for different countries as they embark on this journey. And then maybe the final piece, and probably a great segue slide for Professor Edgar, is just keep in mind when you're thinking about implementing projects, engage the civil society as much as you can early on, not just to discuss things with them, but for advocacy and to co create. But then also think about inclusion by design. So this is not something that comes top down, but comes bottom up, because that's the only way that you can think about an inclusive ID. I'll stop here, but Professor Edgar, please take the stage, and maybe you'll have to do a better job with the clicker.
Right. So thank you all very much, particularly to Dr. Attic for the opportunity to present some research findings. I'm an academic based at the London School of Economics, and as was mentioned, I've been studying digital identity systems for over 20 years, which makes me feel old. I am old. You can't just say it's since the pre-pandemic kind of times. And the two presentations are very, very complementary, but also taking slightly different perspectives. But we both share this really real concern about the perennial challenge of identity exclusion. And we've seen this over the past day and a half. Lots of the questions up onto the Slido have been, how can you deal with different excluded communities? And this is something that I've also been writing about, and this is where you reveal how old you are. So 20 years ago, we did a report about ID systems in the UK. And one of the recommendations that we wrote in 2005 for the design of good ID systems was to limit the risk of exclusion and the abuses that come when not everybody can be inside the system. We then wrote that up into a book in 2010. And again, we emphasized that any identity policy should explicitly address concerns about identity exclusion. World Economic Forum 2015, talking about a new social contract around digital ID systems, see inclusive ID systems as one of the 5 key characteristics of a good ID system. McKinsey in 2018, in their big influential report about the benefits of digital identification, warn of the dangers that exist with traditional IDs that are made much worse for digital IDs around the problems that arise if people are excluded. And of course, we have the World Bank principles on identification, and the first 2 principles are explicitly about inclusion. So before everything else, the first 2 principles in the World Bank led principles are about making sure that identity is available to all, so addressing SDG 16.9, and then also designing in inclusive activities. And Dr. Attic mentioned in his opening keynotes the identity system self-evaluation framework that 38 countries in Africa have undertaken. And he reports that one of the widest variances across all of the different measures that that self-evaluation framework has was around inclusion, suggesting that this is a particular challenge for the countries in Africa because there's so much variation as to whether you think you're relatively inclusive or relatively less inclusive. So the research that I've been doing has been speaking to a wide variety of identity organizations across the identity supply chain. And one of the participants had a very, very nice, honest articulation of what the problem with identity exclusion is for organizations, particularly commercial organizations. The socially desirable answer, they said, would be that this is our top priority. We're constantly working on it. The realistic answer is with all of the pressure on our roadmap, delivering products, delivering services, dealing with inclusion falls down by the wayside. And so the research that I've just completed is looking at the economic costs to organizations of identity exclusion. So what do these organizations face when they try to be more identity inclusive? Everyone agrees that this is an important issue that needs to be addressed. But when you speak to the CEO and say, can we spend some money on addressing identity exclusion? That's when people go, not so sure. Well, let's focus on the low hanging fruit, the 80% or whatever it might be. Given the wide range of organizations that we've spoken to and the very, very different contexts that those organizations face, I'm not going to be able to give you and say, this is the cost in dollars or pounds or euros of addressing identity exclusion. But instead, I can give you a sense of some of the kinds of activities that identity organizations, whether they're relying parties, whether they're civil registries, whether they're national identity systems, need to undertake in order to be much more inclusive. And these are the kinds of things that you can then discuss in the organization to know how to respond, how much it's going to cost you to do that, etc. So this, as I say, is an academic research study. It's a qualitative research study. We did 45 interviews with 51 participants. A couple of interviews had more than one participant. Some of the people who we interviewed, I know, are at the conference. So thank you very, very much for giving your time. The interviews typically lasted an hour, took place over Zoom. And because of the way our Zoom configuration was set up, we auto-generated transcripts. So we had just over 450,000 words of conversation around the issues of identity exclusion. The countries that were discussed by participants, 61 countries in total, obviously a lot around Europe and North America, but also a fairly good coverage of experiences of identity exclusion in African countries as well. So for the research study, what do we mean by identity exclusion? Well, we contrasted those people who are on the happy path, the ones who can do a very quick onboarding journey. For example, they may need to present proof of ID, for example, to open a bank account. In the ideal world, they already have a photo ID. They then just compare the photo ID with a selfie because they've got a sophisticated smartphone. And if they need to do some biographical data checks, there's also a good set of records that you can also check that the person exists. And in an ideal world, you've automatically opened your bank account, obtained your financial services or whatever, without even having to visit a branch, without even having to travel for 8 hours to undertake a particular transaction. We contrasted that with the identity excluded, who are the people who typically found themselves on what we call an unhappy path. So this could be someone who doesn't have an official photo ID. And as I say, lots of the questions that have been coming up over the last 2 days have been about how you can make sure that everybody has an official ID. There are also issues about people who struggle to take selfies, or the selfie doesn't actually recognize their face. The image comparison algorithm may be biased, or they have a thin or non-existent file of biographical data. And as a result, they're often unable to open an account and therefore become financially disenfranchised. This is not to say that they are necessarily unable to get financial loans, but it does mean, and this is a global phenomena, that if they do manage to get a loan, they will be charged a lot more interest than someone who's been on the happy path. So it's not that you can't do anything, but you'll continue to be disadvantaged in that kind of a way. And this is often not just a kind of concern that's particularly prominent in Africa, although lots of the questions have been raised. Not having an official photo ID is also something that happens in the UK and in the US. So there was a recent study in the UK that estimated that nearly 6 million individuals out of a population of about 70 million cannot verify their identity through traditional means because they lack the relevant documents in order to verify their identity. In the US, 4.2% of US households, about 5.6 million households, were unbanked in 2023. Now, some of those were people who just choose to not have any engagement with the financial sector. But for those who do want to become banked so that they can get more affordable loans, the main concern that they had was that they wouldn't necessarily have official photo ID. So what kinds of concerns arise in relation to struggling to take a selfie? So this could be that you just have a physical disability. In order to take the selfie, you've got to hold your phone up straight. If you have a physical disability, if you have tremors, it can be incredibly difficult to take a selfie, and therefore that authentication process falls by the wayside. It may be that the user device, particularly in many economies, are much more varied. So how can you guarantee that the right device will get the right kind of image? So what kinds of activities could organizations that want to be more identity inclusive take? Well, first obvious one is think about alternative authentication mechanisms. Maybe, although selfies, biometrics is a great path for those who are following the happy path, maybe it's not so good for people on the unhappy path. Maybe you need to look into some form of assisted digital, ideally close to where the people on the ground actually are. And even just for the quality of the selfie, if you're doing that comparison, there are lots of tools that the software can now do, for example, to blank out the background, to focus on the face, etc., etc. The image comparison algorithm may be biased. Is the algorithm calibrated for your user population? Lots and lots of the biometric algorithms historically were calibrated on white European faces. And that's not going to be a universally acceptable and appropriate thing. So you need to think about what demographic coverage you will need for your organization to be more inclusive. And there is a cost associated with understanding the demographics of your client population that you need to deal with. If you are procuring biometric services, does your procurement process include addressing questions of bias? And if it doesn't, where are you going to get the expertise to ask the right questions to make sure that the biometric services that you are using actually address the concerns that you have? And who do you trust about how good these biometric services are? Is there a role for an independent alternative, an independent assessment of biometric alternatives? Thin files, again, introduce a whole range of alternative additional activities that you need to introduce. What alternative data sources may be available? It might be that in your context, social media data is incredibly helpful for confirming that this person probably exists and has existed for a reasonable length of time and isn't just a fake account that was created for fraud. How do you evaluate the performance of alternative data sources? What's the effort to know whether this data source is going to be better than that data source? Or maybe this data source gives you a similar performance as that one, but you can get it for half the cost. What's the business process for making those kinds of decisions? If you come from a systems background, what's the cost of change of introducing new data sources into your organizational processes? Because you're going to be changing existing code, you're going to be linking new data sources, you're going to be collecting new sorts of data. And are there regulatory requirements that kick in at that point as well? Got a couple of minutes left. One of the things that we've come out from thinking about this is that perhaps let's approach the problem differently. Let's not focus on those last 20% or 10% or 30% or 50%. Everyone talked about 80-20, but nobody actually had an 80-20 split. Let's think about widening the happy path, making identity inclusion your objective, because there are huge economic benefits to going, let's try to be much more inclusive. Simple example, there are reports that the spending power of people with physical disabilities is likely to be $8 trillion in the next few years. If you are a commercial organization and your systems do not deal with physical disabilities, you are basically saying, we don't want $8 trillion worth of business. Now, if you present that to your board, you get a very different conversation about identity inclusion. Another one of our participants said, I think that's part of our problem. In the ecosystem, there isn't an articulated value proposition that's beyond pounds, shillings, and pence. So we need to change the narrative around exclusion, not in terms of, oh, they're the ones that we'll deal with in due course, but what business opportunities might we have missed? How significant is the problem for our particular organization? Government organizations, financial sector organizations will have very different significance on those. How do we recover from the problem and make our services more inclusive? And how do we limit our future problems? My main frustration, another participant said, with the identity landscape as it exists today, is that when people try to engage digitally and then they're denied something important, they shouldn't be required to solve it for themselves. We can solve it for them. We should be putting the emphasis on widening the happy path. How do we get people more engaged in a positive way in order to make their lives easier? This should be more than just risk mitigation strategy on the part of organizations. So there's a clear agenda for the business case for making identity much more inclusive, for widening the happy path. Inclusion by design is one of the ways that you can explore that. And as we're running out of time, the full report, this was literally a 16-minute version of will be launched on the 12th of June. If you want to join that launch event, click on the QR code and it gives you an opportunity to sign in either in person or also online. And finally, just to say thank you to the sponsors of the research who have paid for the work that we have been doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Edgar. This was great. And I think it was a great transition. I'll let you settle in. Thanks. A great transition to a couple of questions that we received, which I'm also happy to respond to, but maybe I'll kick us off and I'm sure you'll have a better answer. So one of the questions that we got, since informed consent is essential for digital ID registration, what are the best and most reliable practices to inform deaf or blind individuals? And the one I want to connect it with is, are there universal guidelines for accessible consent processes for deaf or blind users? So I'm not exactly sure or aware of any particular guidelines, but I'm happy to hear more about this. I think there are different ways. So one of the programs that we worked on with Nadra, which in Pakistan, has focused on providing special IDs to deaf and blind individuals. They have certain serial numbers, certain features, are connected to certain services where they already have the capability in the systems in order to accept such IDs. And this wasn't, I mean, this is what I'm speaking of is at a design level, but there was a lot done in terms of advocacy. There was a lot done with civil society organizations. There was a lot done with through different regional and government extension agents, such as health service officers, in order to sort of roll these out. So it wasn't a one-off process where we thought about the design, but it took years for it to take place. And while it's hard, I think it can be done and is being done in some countries.
Yep, you can hear me. There certainly are standards and guidelines about dealing with differently abled people, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things in the report is a list of some of those additional resources that can be provided. So they definitely do exist. I have a slight difference of opinion about the role of consent um, in relation to enrolling in a digital ID system, which is more about it's often easy. If the ID system is not going to do anything that's really going to surprise people, then you can separate out the legal requirements for processing personal data from the ethics, the consent-based activities. And so in that sense, it's a broader issue than just these people have difficulty with hearing or difficulty with seeing, and how can they agree to enroll in an ID system. But exactly what you were saying about supporting communities who are differently abled in a whole variety of ways, learning difficulties, mobility issues. It's not just sight and hearing. There's a whole range of issues that you need to be starting to design your systems from. And unfortunately, from a business perspective, having those specialist skills, being able to engage with those communities is not going to be straightforward, but it is something that needs to be done if we want to really address this question of being much more inclusive from the very beginning.
Great. I have two questions that were addressed directly to you. So, what's your opinion about identity inclusion in Africa, due by as a result of the different responsibilities of political parties? Maybe just thinking more about what do the political sort of landscape how it can contribute to identity exclusion. And then another one, which was, have you encountered any good practices from Africa in your study?
So we did have a couple of people, well, a couple of people specifically speaking about their African experiences, and then including Dr. Attic, and also people who, as part of their broader role, had examples from a number of different African countries. And we've tried to draw as many of the insights from those in the full report. So you're going to have to wait until the 12th of June to see those. Uh, on the kind of political angle of this, certainly one of the ways that I find incredibly helpful to think about it is you want an ID system for the nation rather than just for the nationals, the citizens in the particular country, because all of the processes that you can improve and the time savings that you can do should be able to apply to anybody who legitimately is in the country rather than just your nationals, just your citizens, because then if you don't do that, you're going to have two separate processes, one for country X nationals and one for country X residents, as a simple example. So I would always see it as being anybody who is legitimately in the country should be able to enroll into the system so that you minimize those issues. And of course, there will be political that pushes the question of who do we actually allow beyond citizens to have access to that. But we've got 4 minutes and we can't solve that in 4 minutes, unfortunately.
Maybe adding on a few examples that we've seen that have worked really well is obviously a great communications campaign that has to go in tandem with the launch of an ID program or a change or an update in how the services could be accessed. So, for example, Nigeria, I think, is a great example where they not just created amendments to their statutory or legal reforms or had legal reforms, but NIMC also created like these set of policy and or strategies that were gender inclusive, that supported marginalized groups. So they had a gender-based risk violence strategy, and then so with all of those things in place, then they also rolled out like these mobile campaigns where people were going to the villages and making sure that the people who were traditionally disadvantaged were getting enrolled. I think Nigeria was a great example, so I applaud them for that. I think in some of the other countries outside of the region, we've seen Philippines do a great job. So they actually involved a lot of local celebrities, and they did a lot of campaigns and educational videos. In Pakistan, for example, they used IVR quite often. So you would get a call on your phone and you would go through a battery of questions. And this is great for someone who can't read or write. I think in Ethiopia as well, we had a lot of, and this is all on the website as well. They released a lot of information campaigns for a lot of different types of individuals. So you could really look into the exact resource that you needed. We're also, yeah, we're a bit out of time, but maybe one last question and then we'll probably end the session. So this is probably an interesting one for everyone here. So how will the future of digital identity be affected by the increase in image enhancement technology using AI tools? And maybe I'll broaden this question and focus a little bit beyond just image enhancement technology, but what are the different tools that we can use and connect this with?
So, as part of this research, I participated in a number of industry events where the issue of deep fakes and AI was a huge issue. So it starts with the images that can be made to look very much like you, but even though you've never actually enrolled. If you really want to get paranoid, you can then also have viruses and software that will attack your device. And so you're trying to do the selfie and you think that the camera is actually taking a photo of you, but the image that is being sent to the authentication service is actually a corrupted one because they've attacked that whole supply chain. I suspect it's probably at this time much more of an issue for initial identification activities rather than authentication. A lot of the people that we spoke to talk about how you can monitor identity transactions and go, okay, Edgar normally looks like a white guy with not very much hair. He normally authenticates his face in London. Now there is somebody with a much darker skin tone with lots of hair authenticating in Addis Ababa. Let's double check to put on some more security checks around that. So there's lots of tools that lots of suppliers are working on because they really recognize how significant that problem is going to be.
No, I think well said. And maybe just adding on to that is what's really key here is that we need to have an ID system that people can trust. So it needs to be built for trust. People will only adopt what they find useful and safe. So when you're thinking about this, think about what kind of changes that you might want to make to think about obviously the statutory risk, the technology risk, procedural exclusion that we just talked about. But these are probably broader things that we now need to actively address in our countries, either through governance frameworks, either through how data is shared, what kind of cryptography is used when you're using your digital ID, what is the binding mechanism. All of these things will become really important. And I think the more we start thinking about these now, the better we'll be in the future for tomorrow. So I'll end us here. Okay, great. We're on our last 5 seconds, but we are around for the rest of the evening if you have any specific questions. And also, I know we couldn't go through all of the questions, so we'll just find us and we'll answer them. Thank you so much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mustafa Mahmoud. I'll be moderating. Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mustafa Mahmoud, and I'll be moderating the next session. Allow me to invite my panelists to take a seat here. We'll be joined by Thandeka Chauke, the Statelessness Unit Head from Lawyers Hub, Kasida Abdullahi, the Program Manager, Hakina Sheria, Kenya, Elizabeth Atori from ISA, Uganda, Program Manager, and Joseph Zebaze, the National Coordinator of the Cameroon Network on Human Rights Organizations. And lastly, but not least, Susan Mwape, the founder and Executive Director of Common Cause Zambia. It's rather interesting to have this session just after the World Bank session, because I feel like they've tackled most of the things that we're going to talk about. So we have the task of just diving deeper a bit. And our session is about fostering trust and respecting dignity in the digital systems that we're creating. Allow me to set the context a little bit, because this session is trying to help us understand on how do we build systems that foster inclusion, and not only talking about, how do you build systems that foster inclusion and respects the dignity of the people, transferring them from just mere data subjects to stakeholders in the whole identity regime. So I would like to go to our first speaker, Bwana Joseph Zebaze, and I wanted to just ask you, just reflecting on the World Bank presentation and your experience in Cameroon, what are some of the changes in the ID regime in your country? And to top up that question, I just wanted you to reflect, what are some of the roles that the CSOs have taken to see the changes that you've seen?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. At the level of Cameroon, based on the NGOs advocacy, especially the Cameroon Network of Human Rights Organization, there are many changes in the ID system. For example, the delivery period that was 3 months has been shifted to 2 days. And also, there is the biometric, the one-way biometric, as we used to call, is changing, because normally, since the next 6 months, there will be a unique identity number for each person that is registered, coming for registration concerning the ID. But we think also that the legal framework should capture those changes and also make some amendment, because when there is a provision on the 1990 law regarding national identity that review that someone can be harassed and even bring to prison for 5 months to 1 year, and also pay a fine of 50,000 or 100,000. That means something like $200, just because he forgot his ID card at home. And those, I think that we think that the law should be amended at this level for concerning the legal framework.
Just before I leave you, I just wanted you to look at the example that the World Bank was sharing about Nigeria and the power of changing the message and approach of convincing people about buy-in. Is there any reflections that you could share about Cameroon on how when you change the message, does the uptake increase, or there is no correlation?
Yeah, normally, formerly in Cameroon, people used to go for ID registration because they are of the fear of the police. We believe that government should change this narrative and use a right-based approach, since there are opportunity like the coverage, universal coverage, universal health coverage, the opportunity like access to land, like vote registration. We think that this is the new narrative based on the need of the population, that we as civil society are using and also advocating for the government, so that they can take this approach and convince so that we will have citizens that are engaging for ID registration than citizens that are afraid of the police.
I get you there in terms of the fear factor. Some of us can also relate in terms of our country. I'd like to go to Thandeka maybe. Thandeka, several like an hour ago, there was a presentation by South Africa, and there's a lot of progress that South Africa is making in terms of scaling. Are there any concerns in terms of trust in the system and the aspect of universal coverage?
Thanks, Mustafa. So yes, South Africa has indeed made concerted efforts to ensure not only moving into universal digital ID coverage, but also in ensuring that the necessary legal framework exists to support the system. And there's also been commendable progress in terms of rolling out the Smart ID card, which was introduced in 2013. However, more than a decade after the Smart ID card was introduced, there are still gaps in coverage and certain barriers to access persist. And these then raise concerns over exclusion. And where do we see these challenges in the South African context? We see them in barriers to enrollment. So if you look at the access to birth registration, for instance, in South Africa, a birth certificate is a requirement to get an ID document when a child turns 16 years old. The birth registration is high, but we must be mindful that it only covers a specific subsect of the population, which is children under the age of 5. So we find that there are older children who still experience practical barriers in accessing birth registration and getting birth certificates. And we often see that these issues persist into adulthood, and then they create intergenerational gaps in documentation when those same children can't register their own children when they grow up. The other issues we see around enrollment are barriers to identity documentation themselves. We see this with what we call first-time ID applicants. So when a young South African child turns 16, they approach Home Affairs to apply for their first ID. Even if they have a birth certificate, we are still seeing through our work with Lawyers for Human Rights and the law clinics, a growing number of these young South Africans who are still facing practical barriers to accessing that smart card ID. This is also then combined with the failure to meet what are very strict and stringent additional documentation requirements. The other aspect is naturalized and PR permanent resident holders. So it was only until recently, about 2 weeks ago, that they were able to now transition from the green barcoded ID book to the smart card ID. And we applaud the department for finally resolving this, which they attributed to an IT block that existed in the system. And what this means is about 1.4 million people who were previously excluded from being able to get smart card IDs will now be able to access those IDs. So that's a really positive aspect. In addition to barriers to enrollment, we also see the risk of de-enrollment. And this is where the ID blocking issue in South Africa demonstrates the other side of the coin. So, as I mentioned, there may be barriers to enrollment, but even those who have managed to be documented and registered still face the risk of being stripped of that documentation. And in this instance, the department had been using ID blocking as a tool to manage the integrity and accuracy of the identity management system and the data within it. And of course, this is a legitimate interest, in fact, a necessity to have a mechanism through which we can deal with issues of deduplication, issues of fraud, issues of correcting clerical errors. But the problem here is that this tool was implemented without proper due process. And it resulted in many people who were legitimate ID holders, legitimate citizens, being stripped of their IDs and documentation. Now, the High Court has since affirmed that due process is essential. But in our own ongoing engagements with the issue of ID blocking, we've also seen the enduring impact of this issue on the people who've been affected. So for instance, those who have now recently have the IDs unblocked and still need to transition to the smart card ID system are hesitant now to re-engage with the system due to the trauma they faced through the ID blocking. We've seen those who were not only blocked in the system, but also had their physical documents confiscated or damaged and now need to replace the ID, but can't afford the 140 Rand it costs for the fee to apply for the smart card ID. So there's a financial barrier. And then those whose blocks are yet to be resolved remain locked out of the system. So these are still people who don't have functional identity documents. Other aspect to trust, I would say, is digital literacy and digital inclusion. So there does also still need to be efforts to enhance digital literacy, especially in rural and remote areas, to ensure that everyone can actually benefit from this idea of digital citizenship and e-governance. And what I would say then, Mustafa, are three essential elements for building trust or rebuilding trust where it's been lost. The first would be community-based participation and partnership. So it's essential to acknowledge that trust does grow when people see themselves in the process and see themselves not just as beneficiaries, but as co-creators and partners, whether it's in design, it's in implementation and monitoring and evaluation of digital ID systems. And we at NHR have seen the value of community-based approaches through campaigns where we co-develop messaging and materials with people with lived experience. And the result is better understanding, it's stronger uptake and community ownership. And governments can replicate this by adopting multi-stakeholder models or establishing community advisory groups. And we see this as a practical way to ensure that there is participation, but that this participation is meaningful and continuous. Inclusion by design, I think this has already been highlighted in depth, but I think what I would add to that is the importance of adopting an intersectional approach when it comes to considering inclusion and looking at specific vulnerable groups who are often marginalized and left out. So this is now considering how we bring in gender sensitivity and policies and practices. How do we ensure child-friendly processes? How do we make sure that there is inclusion and accessibility when it comes to persons with disability? And I think a third one, which is key but not often spoken about, is due process by design, in addition to inclusion by design. Now, trust requires transparency and accountability. And one way to ensure that is to get rid of opaque decision-making and also to provide clarity and information on how data is used, how it is collected, how it is stored, and what redress users have when there's a challenge. And I think in this vein, it's also important to consider transparent data sharing practices and even interoperability standards that then help to build confidence in a system.
Yeah, I'd like to pick it up from there and highlighting the fact that even communities are stakeholders. And I just want to bring on board Kasida. Kasida, I know your organization works with community-based paralegals. And are there like opportunities of collaboration between CSOs and government, for example, with community-based paralegals to foster inclusion and remove exclusion out of the picture? And for example, also, while you're reflecting on that, are there some wins that you as an organization that has worked maybe in one way or another, collaborating with the governments, can share for us as lessons?
Thank you, Mustafa, for the question. I think definitely there are opportunities where the government, I mean, the CSOs can collaborate with the government in ensuring there's inclusion for the communities. For example, Hakina Sharia and other partners that we work on citizenship program, we work closely with community-led paralegals. And these paralegals are well trained. We train them on citizenship rights, laws, and registration procedures, and all the required knowledge that they need, so that they support the community members paralegals themselves are people who have lived experience of this discrimination. They've faced challenges in accessing themselves this documentation. And so when we enroll them as our paralegals working with organizations, advocating, helping the communities, they are in a better placed position to understand the challenges the communities are facing and help them acquire this document without any exploitation also. So what do they do exactly? We usually do a lot of outreaches, like they would go door to door, visit hospitals for newborn babies to sensitize parents to ensure each and every child are registered at birth. If they are born at hospitals, even if they are born at homes, mostly the areas that we come from, majority of the communities, some of them do home birth and stuff. So you'd find them not understanding the importance of this documentation and even only would want to acquire it when there's need, maybe when they take the child to school and they're being asked that your child, maybe it's around 7, 10 years or 18, and they need to do exam, that's when they start look for this document for such as birth certificate. And for IDs, even when they attain 18, that's when they start looking for it. So once they empower the communities by sharing with them the knowledge, the legal knowledge that they need, they also go through with them step by step in the process of acquiring this document by slowly building the trust between and bridging the gap between the community and the registration offices, by accompanying them to the chief office, to the registration offices, helping them in filling the application form. For those who are illiterate and do not know where to get these documents, they do not know which form to acquire, they do not know which documents are needed to support the application process. That's what they do. In addition to that, we also collaborate with the grassroots registration offices to organize for mobile registration services. By this, I mean like going with the registration officers to areas whereby there's limited access to registration centers, offices. There's challenges such as road, access, transport, and all those. So we're able to facilitate taking these services closer to the communities. And through this, I think so far, since we started this program back in 2015 or 17, we've done about more than 30 mobile registration services. And this kind of activities, they mainly depend on the government registration offices, their collaborations, because they're the ones issuing this document. For us, paralegals, we are there to facilitate the process and fast track it. In addition to that, we also do other advocacies around advocating the citizenship access to documentation through documentaries, sharing challenges that are there, sharing success stories, and also through research work. Going back to some of the major wins we've done so far through the collaborations, one of them that I've already mentioned, we've done over 30, and that is just for Haki na Sheria, but there are also other organizations like Nubian Rights Forum working in Nairobi and Kisii. There's also Paranet in Wajir who have done similar work. There's Haki Center who have done also similar work. So we've done several mobile registration services that have contributed to a lot of people accessing this legal identity document. We have also done through strategic litigation cases. The example is, for example, one of the biggest we can share just a few is the removal of the refugee stamp on the refugee birth certificate. I mean, this came after we had litigated the case on citizenship rights for children out of refugee and Kenyan spouses, and also citizenship right of a Kenyan refugee spouse. Now, initially, the birth certificate of a refugee child used to be stamped as refugee, but now it's not. The other thing is the government, as we've heard from the yesterday's presentation, they have the Kenya has now the data privacy officer. Yeah, and that is as a result of the Huduma number litigation case. Again, the data impact assessment is also came up as a result of the Maisha number litigation case. And finally, on also another litigation case is the double registration case, whereby as a result of that litigation case, we have over 14,000 individuals who are affected of the double registration. For those who do not know, double registration are Kenyans who are registered as refugees and were unable to acquire citizenship document as a result of them their fingerprint being in the refugee database, and so we advocated for that. And recently this year, the court also issued a judgment in the favor of the affected people. Yeah, thank you.
It's interesting to learn today that litigation is also collaboration. Yeah, I'll come back to that later on because I know there are principal litigants here in this room, and we learn from them a bit. But allow me to go down south to Susan Wabe. Susan, at what stage are you in Zambia in terms of digital ID? Do you already have digital ID systems? And how is it working at the moment? And also maybe while you're thinking about that, how have you dealt with the issue of consent while you're scaling the rollouts?
Thank you, Mustafa. Zambia is actively advancing its digital identity infrastructure. The government has been rolling out the process, and while we are facing a few challenges around things like internet accessibility, power, our infrastructure in general, we see that there is a lot of commitment from the government in terms of getting the process running. So in terms of what stage we are at, we're still implementing the digital ID system through the Integrated National Registration Information System, and digitizing our civil records and introducing the biometric digital ID. So currently, we still are using our analog ID in the country. On the issue of consent and data protection, the government has implemented a number of measures, and like I said, we've seen a lot of commitment and efforts to try and get the processes going. But there's still a number of human rights challenges that we continue to observe as the digital ID system is being rolled out. For instance, we've seen limited legal framework and oversight. And then I'll start from the Data Protection Act. We have a Data Protection Act, but its enforcement remains inconsistent. There's been talk from the government that they're trying to train people from across the country, like all over the country, but then the comprehensive implementation of it is still lacking. There's also an absence of a dedicated authority. We have a data protection commissioner, but he still requires a lot of support, and that is lacking in itself. So it raises concerns around the issue of potential misuse of personal information, and then there's also issues of lack of knowledge and awareness among citizens who most of whom still do not even know their data protection rights. When we look at the number of people that have been enrolled biometrically, you'll find that the estimates were still around 1.5 million. It could be a bit higher by now, but still we have about an estimate of 9 million people who are eligible. So the numbers are still very low. And this also raises issues of exclusion in that process. And then also the lack of engagement and transparency in the process. The process has been rolling out, several steps have been taken, but we still see that there's very limited public consultation, very limited engagement. People don't know what's going on. Recently, as a positive, we saw that the government rolled out a mobile registration exercise, which will be running to try and raise awareness around the digital ID system. But this is not enough because it's only running for 3 months. And there's still a lot of misinformation going around. Zambia being a country that's going to elections in the next year, issues of ID become very sensitive. And so even as the rollout has been going on, we still see that many citizens are being misled, being given the wrong information that if you go for the digital ID, you're going to be removed from the registers and things like that. So those are some of the issues that we have observed. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Maybe I've had you touch about issues of privacy and what are the threats of having both analog and a digital system, for example, in your country?
Well, I guess the process that's happening because we're trying. They're doing. They're undertaking this process in a dual manner. So there are those of us, for example, myself, who have the old ID, and so our records are being integrated. Meanwhile, there are new registrants who are coming on board who are being enrolled directly onto the digital ID system. So everything works because the ID that we have works perfectly as well. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you so much. My neighbor in Uganda, allow me to come to you now. Tandeka had talked about the trust that has been broken, and she has tried to tell us about how to restore that trust. Are there any reflections that you have in terms of building that trust when that trust has been lost, especially from key stakeholders like CSOs and even the community itself? And also, the topic of participation has been flashed around left, right, and center. How effective participation?
Thank you very much, Mustafa. Well, particularly around the question of trust, a lot has been said. I think even in the previous session with the World Bank, we did touch a lot about how can we build trust within the ID systems. And one thing is certain, efficiency alone cannot build the trust that we need in ID systems. And yet, while we, for example, notice that Africa currently as a continent is at the point where there is adoption of the ID systems, or there are countries like my own that are scaling. Uganda is at the point where we are now piloting the second generation ID after having implemented the ID system from 2015. So if we are clear that efficiency alone does not build trust, and yet we see, for example, that a number of countries, when they're thinking of scaling, will look at how do we increase the numbers, how do we improve the system. And that is good and very commendable. A good example right now is Uganda, because we are thinking, how do we adopt those that weren't previously registered into the system to be able to mass roll out the second generation system. But we need to go a bit further when we are thinking of building trust. And one thing is key: participation needs to be included. And I'd like to touch a bit more on what that would mean for communities and civil society. Because in order for communities to have trust in a system, they need to feel like they are fully, equally, and with dignity inside that system. What does that mean? It touches on aspects of access, it touches on aspects of transparency and accountability and participation in itself. And if we are talking about access and ensuring that people are actually able to get enrolled on the system, legal frameworks do play a role, as we've seen on many of the sessions that we have had the opportunity to listen to. But those legal frameworks could also create barriers for access. So if a legal framework prescribes specific tribes or specific communities that can access digital identity on the basis of their citizenship and nationality, then certain communities are going to be left on the fringes. That's where we'll see examples of statelessness. So it's important that even when we are developing our legal frameworks, we start to think clearly of whom do we know that is not currently included and how do we bring them into the scope. And then now I would really want us to focus on this question of participation. What is effective participation for communities? It's not just rubber stamping. It's not just being included in some few meetings here and there. I think effective participation means voice, being able to know that your voice is more than consultation and it's actually co-governance. That means in order for you to actually say that you've included communities, you need to be able to highlight how their voice has been adapted into processes around legal frameworks implementation, co-design throughout the life cycle of ID adoption. And in order to do that, of course, there is a question of how much information are we giving communities? And I would like to upload the government. And it's a bit difficult. I mean, not difficult, but it's almost rare for civil society to start off like this. But I've seen with the current adoption of the second generation ID system in Uganda, that right from the beginning of the year when the roadmap for the second generation ID system was put out, to the press conferences that have been made. And we have had challenges in terms of timelines because of budgetary issues, but those have been effectively communicated. So what we see now is not a society that questions whether they should or should not get enrolled into the ID system. What their questions are now is, when do we start? How can I access? What are the procedures? And that has been catered for through using the websites and the conferences. But beyond that, participation goes beyond enrollment. So post-deployment, where we see some of the risks and the harms being manifested in digital ID systems, how are we able to ensure that there is also participation in that? Are we able to put in place redress mechanisms for when those harms have been highlighted? Is civil society and community voices included in the rooms that review these systems? And that brings me to my last point around the need to be able to have participation even when we are reviewing the systems, and for which it's important. A good example is to have a human rights impact assessment. We know, for example, that communities have lived experiences of digital ID system rollout, and those lived experiences would be able to identify the current risks that they are facing and the challenges that they have seen. And with that, we would be able to use that information to be included in human rights impact assessments and be able to utilize some of the community monitoring and documentation that is done. As a civil society organization, the initiative on economic rights, where I works with community members to be able to spread information about digital ID systems, how they can access them, be able to channel advocacy around specific issues that they might have. And whilst this is good information that we could use, this is information that could also support government decisions when they are rolling out certain systems. So I'll end here, Mustafa. It's true. It's true. To be able to build trust, we must go beyond efficiency. We must have transparency. We must have accountability and participation. We need to move beyond just normal participation where we are ticking boxes to actually effectively participate, understanding that there are power dynamics at play within digital ID systems. Communities oftentimes have the left hand of those power dynamics because then they are not in the room where decisions are made. So how can we, as all stakeholders, ensure that we center digital ID systems on communities' lived experiences, even when they are not in the room?
Yes. Allow me to be the government that is not given the mic. The governments are just thinking right now, okay, we want to give civil society the opportunity to come to the table. How do we build that trust that if we are on the table, we will not litigate with the information that they give us? And how do you build that trust after you've litigated and you want to collaborate, because I heard collaboration also includes litigation. So maybe 1 minute with us, and then also there are a lot of questions coming in. After the 1 minute rush, we can now, you can take note of the questions that are addressed to you. I can see there are 2 for South Africa, and then the rest of the panelists, you can feel free to choose any. 1 minute, you can begin, Elizabeth. How do you build that trust that you want government to trust you?
That's a very difficult question. I've struggled with that question myself. And the reason is this: I have litigated against the digital ID system in my country, while at the same time, I have tried to build systems of equal participation in terms of ensuring that communities' lived experiences are spotlighted. Now, that particular question does have a lot to do with what's the political will in the room. Is civil, and might be political will alone limits it. Are civil society willing to come to the table? Sometimes the question is not in, the answer is not in the affirmative. Is government willing to come to the table? If both parties are willing, then it's easier to forge a partnership to be able to push inclusion for digital ID systems. But if there are barriers in terms of access to information, in terms of platforms of engagement, then you're going to find that such partnerships are quite difficult to maintain. So a key answer for me would be to create environments, and the UN safeguards framework calls them holding environments, where all stakeholders are actually able to provide input into the ID system deployment and rollout, and where those environments respect and provide autonomy for all participants. Now, that's something that I would like to understand, even from the other countries. How have they done it? I've seen it work on project-based questions, but more sustainable engagement is necessary.
For me, trust, Mustafa, is about honesty. It's about building trust requires all parties to be present at the table. But in this environment, it feels as though everything starts from the top and comes downwards. There's a deliberate assumption that citizens do not know what they want, but they do. And we all have different lived experiences, we have different contexts, and it's important for us to design systems that ensure that they take on board the unique contexts that exist in the different environments, even within a specific country. So to build that trust, we need to get to a place where it's no longer a story of us against them, government and civil society, that our role is to be acrimonious, but for us to get to a place where begin to understand that we are all beneficiaries of these systems. When we have a good system, an inclusive system that has meaningful participation of citizens, not where you go and tell them what you want to do, but get to understand what their realities are, then there's more trust built, there's more ownership built, and you find that it's even easier to roll out a lot of these programs. Thank you.
Okay, I think I get got it. I think trust is earned. You cannot just assume if you have the citizens' trust by if the government brings any project or anything, the citizen will be willing to trust blindly. So the government has to actually be intentional in whatever project they're bringing. For example, this digital identity system, were they really intentional in terms of doing meaningful public engagement, creating awareness, addressing, putting trying to put efforts in terms of addressing the challenges that are already there with the current with the system that was already there, the difficulties the communities were facing, the concerns that the CSOs and the communities were raising in terms of accessing this legal identity document. How intentional is the government trying to address these challenges? So I think trust is just a journey. the government has to show how intentional they are in terms of addressing this and what mechanism are they putting forward. And also in that, through that intention, it's by bringing now the CSOs into the table, the community members into the table, being aware of all these concerns and having proper mechanisms in terms of addressing it before we actually have a digital identity system, so that every person can be included. No one can be left behind, even including even those people from grassroots areas. And yeah, definitely. So I think that's it for me.
Okay, so from my perspective, I would say maybe framing collaboration from a perspective of shared goals. And I do think that in many aspects, civil society and government do work on common goals. So whether that is efficient service delivery, whether that is preventing instances of fraud, whether that is ensuring legal identity for all. And I think that approach can create a foundation for mutual respect and constructive partnership. But there must be an openness to engagement from both sides. Thank you.
Yeah, I think uh, building trust between the civil society and government bodies is something that is not so easy, because as civil society, we like to keep our autonomy, and it then depends on the political will and also on the capacity of the civil society. Because, for example, when it's come on those ID issues, we prepare as an organization a position paper that was released and that was transferred to different ministry, even at the presidency of the republic. And the proposition was useful. But at the end of the day, what was like a small problem for us is that there is no clear recognition. That means you are not called around a table to discuss your proposal. You just see them, you just find them in a press release saying that, okay, from now this is what will be happening, this is what will be changing in the ID ecosystem of the country. And it's clear that it's coming from us, because the law is not what the proposal that has done that you can find in the press release are not in the law. That means the law did not change, but the ideas moved before the law. So I think some of we have opportunities of learning from success story of participation from other countries, and that is what we are also proposing to the state, to local stakeholders, so that they can learn from those perspectives and bring those opportunities at the local level and implement them. But I think this space, like IG for Africa, is also a space where civil society and also government body learn each other, build this type of trust. You know, at the level of Cameroon, every year now we are celebrating the Identity Day and sharing our truth there. So we just need those type of opportunity, talk together, and also some opportunity that can give autonomy to the civil society to engage in view to sensitize the population, in view to evaluate, to assess the means of the civil society and make some reports to propose to the government. I think normally those, I think that should be done to avoid losing our autonomy as civil society actor, and also keeping the capacity to influence the social, the local policies at the level of the country.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joseph. Allow me to move to Kasida and Tandeka with one of the questions that have been raised. How do you reconcile? How can countries ensure inclusion for its own citizens at their porous borders and not to citizens from neighboring countries? Issues of borders integrity and nationality.
And this is a very relevant question in the African context, isn't it? But I think this is where the aspect of interstate collaboration becomes important, where there is collaboration with bordering states in order to come up with processes that ensure that people are not falling through the cracks. I think what's also important is building in flexibility to systems. When we spoke about inclusion by design, when we spoke about due process by design, taking into account the unique context of Africa as a continent and the documentation gaps that exist, but also the specific context of particular countries where there are ambiguities in terms of nationality for particular border communities, and designing requirements around enrollment to accommodate, for instance, oral testimony as opposed to insisting on documentary evidence which doesn't exist. So for some communities who might be nomadic, they are often also undocumented. And those at the border also experience challenges over generations to get documented. I think what's also useful to consider there is approaches that also include collaboration with the community itself. So I know at some instance, South Africa and Lesotho had, border crossing agreements that were also managed by the community members themselves because they could identify each other. So I think it's really looking at how our registration laws, policies, and practices are constructed and seeing whether or not they speak to the reality of the people they're supposed to serve.
Thank you so much.
I think this has been one of the major challenges that the communities in Kenya living near border areas have been facing, especially the northern part of Kenya. One of the mechanisms that the government had put in place is doing vetting process when these communities are trying to get ID document, vetting them so that they can actually, interview them in terms of documentation, verify the document. And this practice has been actually discriminatory practice for the communities because it has denied a lot of people, a lot of genuine Kenyan citizens to get this documentation. While there's that level of corruption from the also government officers, you see, you'd find even those people who are not Kenyan citizens coming from the border areas getting documentation. And again, this vetting has been linked to security issues. And how can you explain the non-citizens who are getting documentation if you are saying that this vetting is in place to remove, for security purpose, to protect the Kenyan citizens, to ensure that non-Kenyans do not get the citizenship documents? That's one part. Through the advocacy work that we've been doing in terms of ending the vetting, now luckily the government had announced the removal of vetting committee sitting. But still, we believe that there's that vetting happening behind back doors. But one solution few of the solutions that I would actually recommend, one of the major one is the government should ensure they issue citizenship at birth. That's one of the most durable solution, I would say. If any citizen is born at birth with a birth certificate showing that having the parent's ID and the birth certificate details, matching, and that's genuinely enough proof to show that this is a Kenyan citizen. Again, there's that challenge of now the communities themselves accessing these services. So that again would bring us back to now government ensuring that there's access to these services to the Kenyan citizens living at the border areas, because at the border areas mostly you'd find there are no registration services or the offices are very limited, and if they're there, the distance is quite long. Just you can think of all the challenges that already some of them the representative from the World Bank has presented here in terms of the distance, the cost, and all that. And considering that these communities are not like well off economically and all that. So if the government would ensure there's citizenship at birth, and also do not link access to registration documents, nationality documents with say, security. rather reinforce security measures at the exact border areas and not in the areas whereby they are nearing the border, but the exact border areas, enforcing the security at those areas and not within the town centers or the urban centers where the communities that are common, you know, with those living in the border areas are living. For example, in Garissa, within the Garissa town, just to leave the Garissa town to when you're coming to Nairobi, there are a lot of security checks. Why are those not check-ins at the border, Somali border areas? Why is it at the middle of the within the country, you know, in between counties that are within the country and not enforced, strengthened at the border areas? Thank you.
Thank you, Kasida. Joseph, you told me you have an interest in that question.
Yeah, thank you. There is a question. Does the police pressure on the population for registration allow or not to reach the goal? Yeah, I want to make a small correction. The police is not making the police is the one making the registration, but there is a provision of the law. Allow me reading it. The law, Article 5 of the law number 90/42 of the 19th of December 1990, instituting the national identity card in Cameroon, which state that any person who does not have his or her national identity card is liable to imprisonment for a period of 3 months to 1 year and a fine of 50,000 or 100 francs or one of those two penalty only. So it is not the police that is harassing people, it's the person who don't have his ID card who will fall on the provision of this law. That's why we are then advocating so that this law should be amended. Passing this clarification, normally there's something also behind this issue. Is that the harassment asking people to have their ID card with them is something that came from our colonial masters. So you will see that many people will resist if you are just asking him to have an ID card. That's why we are proposing a new narrative that instead of asking people to just go and register to keep their ID card, we should show all the benefits that can come with the ID card, the right to vote, the right for people living with disability to have their national disability card that come with many advantages, the right to learn, the right to many other possibilities. So we are advocating to change this narrative, and the civil society is ready to carry the message if the decision makers follows what we are proposing.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Allow me to go to my sister Elizabeth. I want to twist that question about security a bit, and I want to ask you, what are the challenges of excluding people? I think that mic is not working.
It seems the mic does not want me to highlight the challenges. I will try to do justice to that question. My organization does focus on the intersection of digital identity and access to services like health, education, social protection, and how people interact with these services, and what they need to be able to provide to get access. And one of those requirements in certain countries, including Uganda, is a national ID. And it's written in the framework of the law, which is the Registration of Persons Act. And it does bring a question around systems of mandatory ID and what risks come when we make IDs and services tagged to each other, when we integrate that. And a lot of conversation has been had from different governments here who have highlighted what they are doing in respect to health. But we have also seen, for example, in communities that do not have 100% enrollment, and which is for most of our communities, that those that haven't yet accessed those IDs will not be able to access services. They will be left out. The Human Rights and Digital ID, Human Rights for Digital ID Coalition has published a position paper on the effects of mandatory ID. And we have a common position that we've put out that makes specific recommendations. And one of those recommendations is to ensure that we do not tag public services access to the presentation of digital ID, especially if we are not yet at the point where we can say all citizens are effectively enrolled in that system. What that then means is we need to start to think of what we provide for those that are not included in the system. What are the solutions in that case? Are we starting to build these systems, forgetting communities like those that are stateless, children who have been in humanitarian conflict situations that do not have parents to prove that they are citizens by birth, in case that citizenship by birth needs you to trace your lineage. So how do we start to think of some of these questions which are there and they are lived realities, but which we seem not to yet have solutions for?
Um, uh, Tandeka, there are two questions for you, but I want you to prepare. You can be reading them, and I will want you to respond within 1 minute. But before you come, I want Susan to respond to us about the issues of gender issues and digital IDs. So there's a question by a participant: how do you reconcile digital identity and gender issues to ensure inclusion? But while you're also addressing that, there's a question by Jen Mary: what are the strategies that may be applied to simplify registration of members of border communities to ensure inclusion and dignity? Within 1 minute, please. Yeah, do miracles. The last one is about oh, it has disappeared. Talk about the gender issue. Within 1 minute.
Okay, so the issue of gender remains problematic, especially in the marginalized communities, where we find that the infrastructure is not cannot cope with what we are working around in digital ID. So we need to ensure that as we work around the digital ID and the systems that we employ, they take into consideration the fact that women are often the ones that even take the eligible candidates for registration. I think I'll end there.
Thank you. Naneka, the question about South Africa and what are the gaps in birth registration systems? Are there certain groups of children who can't access birth registration? And the issue of the IDs that were denied. The question has disappeared, but within
Yes.
1 minute.
Okay, I think I remember the ID blocking question. It was around the rejection rates and whether there's an indication of the number of legitimate citizens who are deprived of documents. So there is no public information I have come across with regards to the scope of the rejection rate. But I can give you an indication from LHR's own cases, which were 150 that we presented to the court. And this is out of 2.5 million IDs that had actually been blocked without due process. And in all of these instances, they were bona fide ID holders who had been stripped of their documentation. And where the trauma comes in is not just the rejection or denial or deprivation of your identity document, but there were also challenges in that there was a lack of clarity, like, why is this happening to me? A lack of procedural safeguards. What can I do to resolve this? And then the lengthy delays that people experienced in getting resolution, even when they had irrefutable proof of citizenship, like DNA evidence. Some cases would take, 5 or 10 years to actually resolve. And during this period of time, your life is on pause because you can't do anything without an ID document. But I must note that the department has recently published standard operating procedures that now set out a due process or due process guidance in terms of addressing the ID blocking issue. And we welcome this because not only is it an indication of a willingness to be more transparent, but it is also a commitment to prevent future harm to those who are blocked without due process. And I think it really sets a strong precedent for a rights-based approach to practice and policy making when dealing with some of these complicated aspects of identity system management. And then with regards to birth registration challenges, as I hinted in the reflections I shared earlier on, the challenges in South Africa are not in the law, not on paper, but in practice. So it's an implementation where a lot of people are experiencing practical barriers to access birth certificates. And maybe one case I can share, which is a case we were in fact dealing with today, of a client who is called, for instance, Mary. She is a pensioner, over 60 years old. She lives with a disability. She is looking after 6 of her grandchildren who were orphaned by their own parents. And now she cannot access child support grants for these children because they don't have birth certificates. And while we have approached both the local office of Home Affairs for registration and the Children's Court, they've now requested that she must get DNA evidence showing the biological link between her and the children.
Yeah, that's my cue for telling you that it's time. But allow me to take 1 minute and help us reflect on one thing. The theme for ID for Africa this year is My Identity, My Umbrella. Let's reflect. How many of our communities can afford an umbrella? The umbrella is not only for rainy weather. So there are those who cannot afford an umbrella, they'll choose a raincoat. So can they use it during the harshest summer days? No, they can't. So how do we make sure that we have a buy-in for also those people who do not see the value of an umbrella? Do we force them? Do we push down their throats that you have to have an umbrella? So how do we change our narrative? How do we work together to make sure that there is bridging of the digital divide, that not everybody can access this umbrella that we call digital ID? Can we work together? Let's remember the eras of calling civil society evil society is done. Civil society is collaborating with governments because we are serving the same population. First, before being a civil society, we are citizens. So before being government, you're also citizens. So let's work together to build identity systems that work. Join me in congratulating this wonderful panel of mine. Our own round of applause, please. Thank you so much.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our last session for the day, but we ask you to stay seated because we will be announcing the host for 2026. So we don't need you to go anywhere. Take your seats and just wait for 15, 20 minutes because we have to wait for another session to conclude. Oh, Dr. Atit says no. Okay, one. Okay, there's been a change in plans. One moment.
So why don't we? This is my voice. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for staying with us. I know it's been a fruitful and interesting couple of days based on what I've heard from a lot of you as feedback. Excuse me. And we are only halfway through this journey. We have tomorrow, where we are going to go into 3 parallel tracks: the digital identity track, the legal identity track, and then the DPI, DPG track. And then in the afternoon, we will have the financial bankers, the financial stack, and the digital identity in the financial sector. So, so the work, the symposiums tomorrow, choose your track. We will be splitting the rooms, and so we will be able to run one symposium here in 2/3 the room. Another symposium will run in the SkyTrain, and then the third symposium will run in the back half of this room. As I explained in my opening speech 2 days ago, we needed parallel tracks because so much is happening in Africa. And it fills me with great pleasure to see that there is so much happening in Africa. And that, in fact, when you look at what's happening in Africa, there are things that now can be exported from Africa to the rest of the world. And that's exactly what the movement had in mind when we started pushing for Africa's voice to be heard in the international community, pushing for Africa's rightful place in the world, and pushing for Africa self-reliance and Africa First agenda. We're not being nationalist or regionalist or any way you want to call it. We're being basically sensitive to the fact that Africa has special circumstances, special constraints in context and requirements that only Africa can be sensitive to. Everybody else can pay lip service. You know, attend one of our board meetings, which sometimes may have 100 people representing the 48 member states, and you will see there's not a single voice that's exactly the same. Everybody says, everyone says, here's our constraints, here's our requirements. So the power of this movement is its grassroots, meaning bottoms up. We don't sit in European capitals or US capitals or Indian capitals or Chinese capitals. We don't sit in any one of these places saying, oh, how should we deliver the next phase of development for the world? That's not how it works. What works here with ID for Africa is that we start with Africa's problems. We listen to the people talking about their problems, and we start to build a consensus around a strategy for how to address these problems. And so if the outcome of solving these problems is a digital public good or a digital public infrastructure, which we can make available to solve other problems, so be it. But we did not set out to build DPI. We did not set out to create a framework for anything. We set out to solve Africa's problems. And from there, we said we have to solve Africa's problems in a smart way without having to reinvent the wheel each time we face a new problem. So the the power of this movement has been, and you could see the power of this movement. It comes, we said it, from Africa, for Africa, and in Africa. The energy, the power comes from the fact that we are way grounded and rooted into Africa. And it's a rich, fertile land. It's a rich, fertile land, a land of origins, a land of opportunities, a land of new ideas, and a land that does not need to be told what to do, needs to be respected, needs to be given the opportunity. This is why hosting the AGM becomes essentially a symbol. Hosting the AGM becomes a symbol of empowerment for African countries. It's a symbol because it gives the country the opportunity to show its hospitality, share with the world its context. I mean, you're here in Ethiopia. Last year you were in Cape Town. The year before you were in Kenya. And you were able to make your knowledge of that country not based on Wikipedia or based on online information. It was based on you feeling this. So no matter what the online capabilities offer and what the distant interactions can offer, and they do have their own uh, role and own place in this whole um, ecosystem of knowledge exchange. Nothing replaces the importance of being physical, being together. People ask me, how do you maintain your energy? Actually, if I were online, I wouldn't be able to maintain it. I maintain it because I derive it from you. I have this ability to extract energy from your energy. And that really fills me with the necessary sort of resource, emotional and moral resource, and physical resource to keep me going. So I hope you feel the same way when you are next to each other and sharing and exchanging respectfully, listening to each other. So this is why the AGM is a very, very critical element of this community building. And you know, if you've been with us for a while, you know we have started this journey in Dar es Salaam in 2015. I would say when we started it in 2015, I would say maybe 3 or 4 rows, and then the rest was not there. So we had like the first 4 rows, that was our AGM in 2015. And that was generous. So we had 80 government officials that attended in 2015. Today we're at 1,000 government officials. So you might ask, why does the AGM continue to have vital importance? The AGM has vital importance because it's scale. If we go back down to 200 people, 300 people, that is not an annual general meeting. That's not a place where the community can meet each other and interact and see the range of options that are available. We must remain at scale. But that imposes upon us significant constraints, meaning we have to be hosted by countries that can accept our scale or support our scale. And in 2015, I would say few countries would have been able to host the current scale. But over the years, we grew and Africa grew in locksteps. We in fact had countries identified as potential hosts that basically we felt they needed a couple of more years of maturity from the infrastructure. So we waited and we nurtured the relationship and we kept going. So it's exhilarating to see that we grow together. So when an African country announces they have a new center or new airline lines, our team and myself, we're like, oh, this is exciting. Ethiopian Airlines opened up a new route to this area, or another airline, Kenya Airways, is now offering this service. So we monitor the entire network of connectivity because it impacts our choice. And so let me ask, how many of you have attended the AGM physically, let's say 4 times? Raise your hands, 4 times. Wow, okay. And if I said 3 times? At least 3 times, at least 3 times. Okay, so you could see that this community is not just a one-off. You're coming in again and again. So we are about to announce the country host for the 2026. And as I said, we have opened also the applications for candidacy for 2027. I want to tell you, and I'm dying to tell you the country, but unfortunately, I'm being told to wait a few more minutes because the other session has not been able to finish on time like you have here. And also the official diplomatic representative of the country at hand, he or she is on her way. So I would like to ask the operator to give me the signal when the arrival is there. But so let me continue explaining a couple of things. So when we go through and select the host country, what is the process that we use to select the host country? The process starts with a research on the research on the infrastructure that's available in the country. So we look online, we validate, etc. Then we do several visits to validate. So we've done that for 2026. There were at least 5 candidate countries, and we've selected the top country. So operator, I would like to announce. Are we in a position to announce? Can somebody guess? Okay, I heard Benin, Senegal, Ghana, Botswana, Senegal, okay. Malawi, okay. Operator, can I reveal? We're going to lose the crowd. The crowd is anxious. Yay, we want to know. Where is it? 4, 3. Yes, yes, yes. And the winner is Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire. This feels like when the final goal that decided the World Cup was scored. This is as enthusiastic as that. So we are honored to have with us Ambassador Dibbi Bongro Zephyrin, who is the ambassador from the Embassy of the Republic of the Côte d'Ivoire of Ethiopia, who will make his way to the stage to to deliver the acceptance speech. In the meantime, bear with me. There's going to be a beautiful 1-minute video introducing the country. So, operator, please launch the video while we wait for the ambassador.
Côte d'Ivoire, venez voir, une terre d'hospitalité.
Give us audio. Go back.
Côte d'Ivoire, venez voir, un terrain d'opportunité.
Land of welcoming, ground of opportunities.
Côte d'Ivoire, venez voir.
I love the slogan, Mr. Ambassador. Côte d'Ivoire, venez voir. Please.
Dr Joseph Attic, PDG de ID for Africa. Mesdames et messieurs, distingués participants, chers partenaires, la Côte d'Ivoire vient d'être sélectionnée pour abriter la prochaine Assemblée générale annuelle de ID for Africa. C'est avec enthousiasme que nous acceptons cet honneur qui vient d'être fait à notre pays. Je voudrais au nom de son Excellence, M. Alassane Ouattara, président de la République de Côte d'Ivoire, au nom du gouvernement et du peuple ivoirien, exprimer la profonde gratitude de la Côte d'Ivoire à l'endroit de tous les membres de ID for Africa pour le choix qu'ils ont bien voulu porter sur notre pays. Je voudrais vous assurer que la Côte d'Ivoire mettra tout en œuvre pour faire de l'Assemblée générale de 2026 un événement mémorable à la hauteur des ambitions de ce mouvement. Je puis vous assurer que dès à présent, la Côte d'Ivoire commencera à se préparer pour vous réserver un accueil chaleureux l'année prochaine à travers son traditionnel aquaba.
Sí.
My country has just been selected to host the next annual General Assembly of ID for Africa. It is a honor for our country to be selected as a host of this important event. On behalf of His Excellency Alassane Ouattara, President of the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire, the government and Ivorian people, I would like to express our deep gratitude to all members of ID for Africa movement. I can assure you that from now on, Côte d'Ivoire will begin to prepare to give you a warm welcome next year through its traditional aquaba. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much. Before we invite the delegation Ivoirian to the stage to celebrate this moment, I actually want to show you one thing which is very exciting. Move it to the next slide. The event is going to be held in a very brand new facility, which is the Parc des Expositions in Abidjan. Please move the slide. And what's interesting about the Parc des Expositions is that it gives us about 8,000 square meters of exposition space that is very adjacent to the conference. So we will not have pavilions. Operator, please advance the slides. Yes. So this is the new exposition, part exposition. And you could see under the dome, we will have 5,000 square meters of space for conference, and we'll have 6,500 square meters of exposition. So between the two of them, we are over 11,000 square meters. So now I would like to invite the Ivorian, la délégation ivoirienne en scène, sur scène. C'est l'ambassadeur. Merci beaucoup. Merci. Merci beaucoup. Merci. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, madame.
Merci beaucoup à vous.
La musique. La musique.
Côte d'Ivoire, venez voir. Une terre d'hospitalité.
Côte d'Ivoire, venez voir un terrain d'opportunité.
Land of welcoming, ground of opportunities.
Côte d'Ivoire, venez voir.
Africa arise, Africa arise, Africa arise, oh mama. I did for Africa, I did for Africa, Africa arise, oh mama. Africa arise, it is a time now, Africa arise, oh mama. Africa amuka, Africa amuka, Africa amuka, oh mama. Africa amuka, Africa amuka, Africa amuka, oh mama. I did for Africa, mama, hey, for Africa. I did for Africa, mama, hey, for Africa.
Pensa tua, ya tutti no, masha tua, presidão tem que saber. Aqui tá no ele tá. Senhor do lá. Chega lá, já não de não é esperança. Mas eu vou jogar, mano.
Feel the magic in me.
I'm going to go yourself. I'm you saw some of fellowship. On from it, 16, 17, 6, 16, já passou uma folha bem eu não andar numa ambuja. Roda me central, já não fica já não. Ontem vi já vai para todos. 16, já será tudo. Ontem vi já vai para 16, ah, ah, mas se fizer por ah, ça change pas. Ah ouais. Ah, show me, avec red one. Est-ce que ça marche? Ah,
did for Africa. I did for Africa. Oh, mama. Africa arise. Africa arise. Africa arise. Oh, my. I did for Africa. I did for Africa. Africa arise. Oh, mama. Africa